this is the sovereign functioning of the Khalsa, the highest administrative, spiritual body that brings the mystical elements of the Khalsa, their consciousness together. It isn't just a bureaucratic thing. What gives a Gurdwara Committee its legitimacy, winning an election, upholding charity commission regulations, staying within the law, not doing anything illegal. So their authority and legitimacy comes from the state. And within the Gurdwara Committee setup and maaf karna, often the most marginalized and disrespected person is the Granthi Singh. ਜਿਹੜੇ ਗੁਰੂ ਤੋਂ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਨੇੜੇ ਹੋਣੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਆ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਪੰਥ ਨੇ ਦਰਜਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਗੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਵਜ਼ੀਰ ਆ, right? Baba Deep Singh is the example, right? That have the absolute closeness to the Guru and to the Panth. They are seen as mulazams, employees of the Gurdwara, and not given that space that they need to operate, not given the resourcing that they need to operate, and also not having authority outside of the 21-member committee.
This lens that we look at everything that like the West does as better, as more modern, and sometimes we overlook like the significance and why these things are given to us. Even with the Sarbat Khalsa, like one of the things that the Gore recognized when they were looking to try to tackle the Khalsa and in their evaluation of them is that the biggest issue that they had was that they're all autonomous, they're all sovereign. There's a direct quote I remember, like one of the Gore was writing at the time, and he was saying whether there's a Jatha out of 500 Singhs or 5 Singhs, whether he has like thousands of like miles of land or whatever, or he has like nothing, whether he has like a gold shastra or he's got like a stick, their voice is the same. So how do you control a people like
that? The most phenomenal aspect of this is when we look at the 18th century, like the Sikhs just don't lose sight of that. They just go again and again and again, like Zakriya Khan Zulm, Ahmed Shah Abdali's invasions, Chota ka Lukara, Vadda ka Lukara.
So the power of making a decision is essential to life. If we can't make decisions, then we can't respond to circumstances. We can't respond to challenges. We're looking to others, whether it's our local, Gurdwara Committee, whether it's our councillors, MPs, prime ministers, the United Nations, the so-called international community and its so-called international law. We're always looking to be participants in that. We look at a lot of issues within the Panth and we say, why can't this one issue be resolved? In the Panth, there's no shortage of anything. Resources, Javaniya, jo bhi haiga, there's no shortage of it. But why can't we make a decision to move forward? Because those processes have deliberately been undermined and demolished. The authority from the Panth, from what the Panth values, is shifted to the state. The state becomes supreme over it. And that is something that we have to rectify going forward generationally.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome back to another episode of the BOS TV podcast series. Very fortunate that at least once a year we have Bhai Shamsher Singh Ji and Bhai Baljeet Singh Ji on the podcast, where we're discussing topics, whether that be to do with 84, June, November. We had the reaction video that we did with when it came to the brother of KPS Gill. And then last year we recorded also the podcast on Bhai Jaswant Singh Ji, Kaldara, which is in a lot of detail. And we're very fortunate because we haven't just got both of you guys on, we've got Bhai Ranveer Singh Ji on the podcast today as well. So looking forward to even a more of a wider discussion. And the topic we've got today that we're going to be covering very simply is the Sarbat Khalsa. Because this year marks 40 years since, if you want to call it the last, most famous Sarbat Khalsa that took place, that a lot of people will know about, refer back to, which took place in 1986. So this video will be coming out marking those 40 years. And there's a lot of discussion on what is a Sarbat Khalsa. Can we trace it back? What is the history of it? If we're going back, again, this year marking 300 years since Baba Tara Singh Ji's Shahidi as well, and the first Sarbat Khalsa that took place, over 300 years ago in that case. So where do you guys want to start off? I think the first thing, we've done enough introductions, Guru Kirpa, in terms of with all the guests and all the seva that they've done. Let's start with just simply, what is a Sarbat Khalsa? Who wants to start that off?
I think even before we start with the Sarbat Khalsa, we got to look at the concepts, like what is a Jatha and like what is a misal, because those come together to form the collective body of the Sarbat Khalsa. Today, like the conversation around Jatha is quite like reductive, or a Jatha is primarily associated with Kirtan, you'd say, right? But a Jatha is a formation of the Khalsa in a military format, the way the Khalsa is supposed to be, Puran Gursik, like Shastar Tari Nam Bani de Pakke. And a Jatha obviously has a Jathedar. So it's a structure that represents this Miri Piri Siddhant of the Khalsa that comes together as a formation. And those Jathe can be based regionally. There's not one Jatha that the Panth is a part of. All of those Jathe have different geographic regions. They may have slight variations in Maryada, etc. But collectively it comes together as the Khalsa Panth. So that is like a building block of where we get to the Sarbat Khalsa. And we've seen in our Ityas where Jathe have come together to form missiles. And missiles come together to form dals, which will be like larger armies. So all of these units, they may function independently, but at times of attack throughout our Ityas, they've come together to form the basis of the Khalsa's military response, but also its administrative capacity, that we saw all the missiles come together to form Sarkar Khalsa. They were from different alake, and that's what created the functioning of the Sikh government. And then from there we move into decision making. How does that actually function together?
What is probably the earliest account that you can recall of when a Jatha or Jathe have been formed?
I think from Guru Sahib's period, like Tarna Dal, Buddha Dal, etc. Akal Sena from Guru Har Gobind Pasha's time, and then Bidhi Chandiya Dal, which was essentially covert operations type formation. And Buddha Dal, Tarna Dal had different functions within the Panth, looking after the Gurdwara, making sure all of the administration and the functioning of our Dharmic Astan worked in accordance to the Maryada of the Panth in a Sanja Roop. And we've throughout Guru Sahib's time all the way up until the British take over Punjab, we see Jathe functioning as they're supposed to function. And then we see this interruption, which we'll touch on later, that occurs, and then the reformation of the Jathebandiya during the 80s and the 90s, why that was such a crucial period, because Jathe moved from being apolitical, spiritual, purely apolitical, spiritual, into these armed Sangharshi formations. And from 95 to now, we've kind of taken a step in a different direction. From where we were in the 80s and the 90s, where we saw the resurgence of the Jathe functioning in that way, doing leadership of the Panth, having a strategic function, but also being able to give a response when the government challenges us. And now all the government commits oppression, as we've talked about in previous podcasts. Whereas now, if we see oppression from the state, we try to understand it through a lens that makes sense to us because of our limited functioning of our Jathebandiya. So if the state attacks us, we have to automatically go into the roop of the victim, and we have to say, this is against the law, this is against human rights, this is against morals that we put onto the Sarkar, which the Sarkar doesn't uphold themselves. I mean, you can see what's happening in the dunya right now, massive zulm. They don't distinguish between civilians or people they're fighting against. It's just indiscriminate. The more advanced their hatiyar have got, the more able they are to kill people that aren't part of any conflict in order to punish, the collective resistance. And we've seen that. That's what's happened to Sikhs as well, right? In our Ityas, Jarasi, all the rest of it. It was why they committed all of this massive violations on civilians was to punish the Sikhs for resisting and to create fear. So because we have that really complex dynamic, and Jathebandiya aren't functioning in the way that they're supposed to, our political response is limited as well. It doesn't go outside of the boundaries of the state. So the Sarbat Khalsa, we'll get into what it is, but it definitely is not a parliament of the Sikhs, and it definitely doesn't exist within the boundaries of the state. This is the sovereign functioning of the Khalsa, the highest kind of administrative, spiritual body that brings the mystical elements of the Khalsa, their consciousness together. It isn't just a bureaucratic thing. It isn't just about making decisions. It's the Khalsa is part of it, and we'll get into that.
Ravi Singh, anything to add?
Yeah, just on what you mentioned there, the term Jatha and Jathedar and the purpose of being Jatheband, that's an important part of that, and the idea of sovereignty Badshah comes into that as well. So the Sarbat Khalsa, if we were just to look at that term specifically, like Shamsher Singh said, the Sarbat Khalsa is a collective gathering
of Sikh Agus, of Jathedars, of individuals who represent the Panth, and they're coming together to make decisions to advance the Panth forward. And within the Sarbat Khalsa, the central part of the Sarbat Khalsa is the Gurmata. The Gurmata is essentially the Sikh Agus, Jathedars sitting around a table, or however it might turn out to be, and making decisions that are binding upon the Panth. So it's important, I think, also just to briefly look at the term Gurmata as well. And I've got a couple of kind of historical quotes I wanted to share. One from by Ghan Singh Nabha, because he does a really good job in defining like what a Gurmata is. And essentially what he says is that before any dharmic or any sansarik, any worldly task, the Panth would come together to hold a Gurmata. Because the decision to move forward in terms of how to move forward was based on Guru's mat. That was always central within the Panth. That's how the Panth has always worked. So the Purathan Singhs would come together, hold an assembly, a deliberation, and they would decide how to take the Panth forward. And by Veer Singh also, in their writings, they talk about it as well. And they call it a Shromani Jathebandi. That is, like Shamsher Singh was saying, it's the highest decision-making body of the Khalsa Panth. So we have to bear that in mind. And I've got a passage which I wanted to share. It's be a couple of minutes, but I'm going to share it anyway, but just to give us an idea of what, Bhai Veer Singh was writing about 100 years ago. So he says, Gurmata naam Panth di Shromani Jathebandi da si. हाँ ਇਹ ਇੱਕ ਪੰਥਕ ਆਸ਼ਰਮ ਸੀ ਜਥੇਬੰਦੀ ਦਾ। ਉਸ ਦਾ ਤਰੀਕਾ ਇਹ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਅਕਾਲ ਬੁੰਗੇ ਦੇ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਪੰਥ ਦੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਜਥੇਦਾਰਾਂ ਦੇ ਜ਼ਿੰਮੇਵਾਰ ਸਰਦਾਰਾਂ, ਗ੍ਰੰਥੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਪ੍ਰਸਿੱਧ ਧਾਰਮਿਕ ਬਜ਼ੁਰਗਾਂ ਵਾਲਿਆਂ ਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਜ਼ਰੂਰੀ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸੱਦਿਆ ਕਰਦੇ ਸਨ। So they would call all these individuals who were in positions of leadership for the Panth to one place. ਨੀਅਤ ਸਮੇਂ ਤੇ ਸਭ ਨੇ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹੋਣਾ। And this is important as well, ਜੇ ਕਦੇ ਦੋ ਸਿੱਖ ਜਥੇ ਆਪੋ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੜ ਵੀ ਰਹੇ ਹੋਣ, like for example in the Misl period, ਲਿਖਦੇ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਤਾਂ ਗੁਰਮਤੇ ਦਾ ਸੱਦਾ ਪਹੁੰਚਦੇ ਸਾਰ ਲੜਾਈ ਬੰਦ ਕਰਕੇ ਦੋਵੇਂ ਟੁਰ ਪੈਣਗੇ। ਰਸਤੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਾਂ ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰੇ ਪਰ ਕਿ ਆਪੋ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਬਦਲਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੈਣਗੇ, ਇੱਕ ਦੂਜੇ ਤੇ ਵਾਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਗੁਰਮਤੇ ਦੇ ਨੀਅਤ ਸਮੇਂ ਅਕਾਲ ਬੁੰਗੇ ਦੇ ਹਜ਼ੂਰ ਸਭ ਪਾਸੇ ਤੋਂ ਰਸਤੇ ਬੰਦ ਕਰ ਮੈਦਾਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੀਵਾਨ ਸਜਦਾ, ਕੀਰਤਨ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਆਵਾਜ਼ੀ ਲਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ, ਫਿਰ ਕੜਾ ਪ੍ਰਸ਼ਾਦ ਵਰਤਦਾ, ਸਾਰੇ ਛਕਦੇ। ਐਂਡ ਦੈਨ ਹੀ ਸੇਜ਼ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਜਥੇਦਾਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਅਰਦਾਸਾ ਸੋਧਦਾ। ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਮਗਰੋਂ ਹਰੇਕ ਆਇਆ ਸੱਜਣ ਉੱਠ ਕੇ ਅਕਾਲੀ ਜਥੇਦਾਰ ਦੇ ਸਨਮੁਖ ਹੋ ਆਖਦਾ ਕਿ ਮੈਂ ਸੱਚੇ ਸਤਿਗੁਰੂ ਦੀ ਹਜ਼ੂਰੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਪੰਥ ਦੇ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਲਾਭ ਲਈ ਆਇਆ ਹਾਂ। And then he goes on to talk about that was the maryada of the Gurmata. That there would be, Guru Sahib would be central. There's also reference to how there would be Prakash or Guru Granth Sahib Ji as well as the Sambani. Kara Prashad would be made, Ardas would be made, and that's how any Karaj then would begin.
Just in some, you can just translate that for in simple English for the Sangha that might not understand.
Of course, yes. So essentially, he's detailing the actual the protocol on the day. So what would actually happen. So he says that it would take place at the Akal Takht or the Akali Bunga, as it was also known. And the entire Gurmata would be led by the Akalis. And they would send out an invitation to any representative Sikh body. So any Jatha, any organization, any Dal, Misl, whoever it might have been. And then they would come together, and if there was any indifference between a Jatha as well, so for example during the Misl period, we know from our Jathas that some of the Misls would fight as well. At the moment of the Gurmata and the Sarbat Khalsa was happening, those differences would be put aside, and they'd come together because they understood that they're all a part of this one Panth, right? So if they had any differences, they'd be left at the door. They'd come in, and Ardas would take place. Hukamnama would be taken. Kara Prashad would be also then given out, and then they'd sit to deliberate and discuss and decide on what it is we're going to be doing. And also in our Jathas, the Gurmata wasn't just held as a reaction to something. It was something that the Sikhs would do proactively. And that speaks to that sovereign mindset of that Pathshahi Dawa that the Sikhs have. So twice a year, and I'll come on to it in a little while, but Ratan Singh Pangu in Panth Prakash talks about how the Panth would come together during Vaisakhi and during Diwali. So that was two biannual Gurmata that would always happen. So and it goes into a lot more detail, but that in essence is how the actual Gurmata would run. And interestingly, so obviously Bhai Veer Singh is writing about 100 years ago, right? There's a book by a British writer called John Malcolm. He writes in 1812, So he's obviously writing 100 years before Bhai Veer Singh. And in English, he says very similar things. He says, when a Gurmata or a great national council is called, all the Sikh chiefs assemble at Amritsar Sahib. The assembly, which is called the Gurmata, is convened by the akalis, and when the chiefs meet upon this solemn occasion, it is concluded that all private animosities cease and that every man sacrifices his personal feelings at the shrine of the general good. And he goes on to kind of, pretty much say what Bhai Veer Singh says later on. But language is really important within this, like how he calls it a great national council. Because obviously it was the Punjab belonged to the Sikhs, right? So for us, it's like if we were to try and draw a comparison, if you imagine, like for example, in the UK government holding cabinet, having a major security council meeting where you've got the generals, you've got like the home secretary, the foreign secretary, that's essentially what will take place. But according to our own Maryada and our own Rahat.
Why, during the time of Vaisakhi and Diwali, why were those the key dates?
I think it was more than anything else, from my understanding, it was more so from a practical perspective, because Sikhs were always going to be coming to Amritsar Sahib anyway. There was a period where there was a ban placed on that, but because the Sikhs never lost sight of their political ambitions, that was reinstated. Actually, just after Bhai Tara Singh Shahidi in 1726, that we're marking 300 years of today. So it was just from a practical perspective, they would come together, so that it would make sense to have it there. So also with the Gurmata, there's multiple references to Mate happening during the Guru's time as well. So often, jadon aapa itihas padhde ha, we often think that the Sarbat Khalsa starts after 1726. But there is reference to Mate taking place, like I said, even during the Guru's time. So there's one particular example related to Guru Arjan Dev Ji Maharaj. So when, as we know from our Itihas, Prithvi Chand was very jealous as the older brother. He felt that Guru Ramdas Ji ought to have given the Gurta Gaddi to him. And so what Prithvi Chand does actually is he complains to Jahangir. And he also takes it up with somebody called Suli Khan. Suli Khan was a general within the Mughal Empire, and he says that I ought to be sitting on the throne. We need to attack Guru Arjan Dev Ji. And Gurbani vich bhi da, udaharan aanda hai. So in Gurbani, so when this happens, the Sikhs of Delhi, they come to know of this plan that Prithvi Chand has planned to assassinate Guru Arjan Dev Ji. So the Sikhs in Delhi, they write a letter to Amritsar Sahib, to where Guru Sahib Ji is. And so when news of Suli Khan's kind of pending arrival reaches the Guru writes about this in Guru Granth Sahib, in Ragasa. They say, Prathme mata je prati chalavo, dutiye mata dwe manak pahunchavo. They say in the first mata, so they're talking about like when they've heard this news that mata didn't take place. So the Sikhs sit down with the Guru and they deliberate, how should we respond to this impending invasion by Suli Khan? And then they say, Tritiye mata kich karo upaya, main sab kich chhod prab tu hi te aya. So Guru Sahib gives us, like in the first mata, I was advised to send a letter. In the second mata, I was advised to send 2 men to mediate, to negotiate. And the third mata, I was advised to do something. And in the end, they say, main sab kich chhod prab tu hi te aya. And so there are references to the Sikhs being Jatheband or organizing to deliberate how to move the Panth forward, even from the Guru's time. So that's obviously Guru Arjan Padshah. And then in Guru Bilhas Padshah and Shevi as well, there's reference made to Mate that were made by the Sikhs in Lahore before the battles that were waged under Guru Hargobind Sahib Padshah. And the term that we used, this is maybe important to kind of outline as well, that it wasn't necessarily a Sarbat Khalsa, because the Sarbat Khalsa, by its very nature, happens after 1699 when the Khalsa is formally manifested and created, right? But the idea of the Panth coming together and holding a Gurmata, which essentially is what a Sarbat Khalsa is, was happening from the Guru period. So there is reference, and obviously Guru Sahib creates the Akal Takht within 12 days of them sitting on the Gurta Gaddi. They raise the Akal Sena, like Shamsher Singh was saying, Baba Bidhi Chand, by Pirana Ji, by Pera Ji, by Jeta Ji, 4 generals are made to head up 100 strong contingent. These things are not happening by coincidence, and that is tied to the Panth Shahi, the Guru's Darbar. So there's multiple references that we have in our Itihas to the Gurmata happening actually from the Guru period.
Guru Sahib was building this process, as Ranveer was saying, like over multiple jamme and taking the Sangat through this process to get us to that point of being Jatheband and running the administration of the Raj Parvanda that they were setting up. And, you know, I just want to reinforce the point that Ranveer Singh is making, that they're not separate things. The administration of the Khalsa as a sovereign entity and our Kamai as Gursikhs, they cannot be separated, and they never were separated. Like from Guru Sahib's period, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹੁਕਮ ਸੀਗੇ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ to keep Shastra, to keep Kaur Sawar, because they were creating you know, the cutting edge of the administration in terms of ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸ਼ਸਤਰਧਾਰੀ ਰੂਪ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਖਾਲਸੇ ਨੂੰ. How can the Khalsa govern effectively if it's under the military might of another Raj? So in order for the Khalsa to challenge the Mughals at the time and to challenge the zulm that they were seeing from the Brahman, from the Qazi, from ਜਿੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜ਼ੁਲਮ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਸੀਗਾ ਸਮਾਜ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ, they had to have their own decisive force. And, you know, obviously decision making is a massive part of it. But yeah, I just want to emphasize that point, that the Jatheband entity of the Khalsa carries out both of these functions at the same time. The Kamai keeps them on that track so that they don't then do zulm. You know, a lot of our Ityas is about Sikhs fighting for the values that they believe in, that, you know, they see zulm happening in Samaj, and zulm de khilaf ladde hamesha. Like our Shastar Kirpan, you know, like when jado arth kadde hain, when we take the meanings, we try to translate what a Kirpan means, we go to a lot of like effort to explain that it's not just a weapon. You know, the word's definition is broken down, is tied to Kirpa, is tied to, you know, you know, to so that the Shastra in the hand of the Khalsa fulfills this samajic, this social function, in order to, you know, give boundaries, essentially. Koi zulm na kare kise duje de utte, no power can come into ego and try to dominate any aspect of a Kalpurk's creation, whether that's like, you know, Ji Janvar, you know, or, you know, Tarti or other people. And Khalsa has always fought in opposition to that.
Yeah. And this is why, like, it's an integral part of the Panth. Like, Guru di chalai hui reet, like the Gurmata, like I said with this example to Arjun Pacha. But also there's reference that we get from Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Darbar as well. Kavi Senapati, who's a court poet of the Guru's Darbar, speaks about how these Gurmata would take place. Ratan Singh Pangu talks about it as well. But Kavi Senapati says, Mil panchan kino mata, taraya sang apar, ek or payo khalsa, ek or sansar. And there's multiple references that, you know, we can go to in Aparatan sources, which is why I always make this point. It's really important that we engage with our history and go to those pre-colonial Sikh texts. So when we look at like the world that's created of what a Sikh is before 1849 by contemporaries of the Gurus, and then what we're told about what Sikhi and what Sikhs are about as a quote-unquote religion after 1849, there's a gulf of difference there. So there's no kind of two ways to look at our history when we're centering Puratan sources, and also then you know, using what we find in Gurmani, any specific Otanagal or episode that we have in Guru Granth Sahib Ji that comes up. So like I said, the Panth would assemble twice a year. There's reference to the Gurmata taking place in the Guru period, and into the 18th century, there's multiple references. If you think about all of the major kind of episodes that we can remember from the 18th century, even Bhai Taru Singh Shahidi, Zakaria Khan's Zulm, Ahmad Shah Abdali, Durrani, ਜਦੋਂ ਵੀ ਪੰਥ ਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਸੀ that they're going to be attacked, they would always assemble. And then, as is natural, because you're a fighting force, right? So you need to figure out your strategy, your tactics. In addition to the administrative, proactive thing, there was also this idea of coming together and deciding unanimously. And that's the other thing as well. The actual decision-making process was that the decision had to be agreed upon by every Jathedar present. So it wasn't this idea of like majority vote wins. It was either we're all agree to this or it doesn't happen. And there are instances also where the Panth didn't agree. So in those instances, so for example, there's an episode that Ratan Singh Pangu talks about where a Brahman comes to the Akal Takht and he asks the Sikhs, the Khalsa, to help him because these Pathans in Kasur have taken his wife. And so the Khalsa deliberate, and half the Khalsa say we should help the Brahmin and go and attack Kasur. The duje paase Kai Singh kende ne ke, well, the Pathans in Kasur number 12 lakh, right? 1.2 million, I think that is. And at the time, the Khalsa numbers were a few thousand. So they were like, well, it doesn't actually make, strategic sense. So what happens in that instance is that they take a hukamnama from Guru Granth Sahib Ji. So that if the Sikhs can't decide, then it's left to the Guru. And actually, I've got a reference to that the hukamnama that comes up in our Jathas. It came from Basant ki Var, Panje Badi Mahabali Kar Sacha Toa. So we have these real examples in our Puratan sources that when the Gurmata was happening, how it would function, what would happen if the Khalsa couldn't decide. So there are protocols pretty much for everything. Yeah.
I was going to say as well that what's really important to know is that as these developments were going on, like Shamsher Singh mentioned as well, that they were all linked. I think sometimes we can look at history and think that these were reactions. Like Guru Hargobind Sahib was it was a reaction to Guru Arjan Sahib Shahidi. But as the things were talking, that this is a development over decades, over centuries, if not, from Guru Nanak Sahib, all the way building the Qawm and building the Qasiyat, the Qabiyat, the institutions. All of this stuff was linked to the Guru's project, right? And in the same way, as we're going to speak about later on about the Sarbat Khalsa, if we don't look at it in that way, then we see these things as just a reaction. And because there's no Mughal now, the Mughal Darbar isn't there anymore, then we don't need a Sarbat Khalsa, we don't need to operate in the same way. But whereas this was part of those, when Guru Hargobind Sahib picked up the weapons and said, now is time, we're gonna and even still they didn't initiate Jang straight away. They built towards that point, and then when the Khalsa was ready, then we took the action.
It's a very interesting point that you make about the whole reactionary stuff as well, because when I remember reading about Guru Hargobind Sahib Ji's take upon the Talwar as well, there's reference to Guru Arjan Dev Ji telling them, or even saying to Baba Buddha Ji or to the Guru Sikhs, the Panch Guru Sikhs that were in Lahore with them, that tell my son to be Shastratari. So it was like a practice there that came from Guru Sahib Ji as well. I know this has come later on in the podcast, but I thought I'd just chuck in here if you guys don't mind. Like, you're talking about how these things are still relevant today. There's no Mughal. But couldn't someone say, well, we have that today. We have these Gurdwara committees. We have the Panth coming together in different ways, or Gurdwaras coming together. Isn't that the same thing, or is it not the same thing? Committees and these, what we call... Short answer. How is it not the same thing? Just for someone that may think it's the same thing. Sarbat Khalsa now.
Yeah, what is the Mahanta essentially? This process?
What's so special about this, that we've got this new system now, and why isn't this better, or like it's evolved over time?
So I think it comes down to the separation of religion, of separation of Miri and Piri, let's just say, from our perspective, right? Sadi boli de vichon, where you can have Piri, but Miri is something that is relegated to the state. So we have our own understanding. So Piri is our tapasya, like asi jiri anaditi dunya, the unseen world that has our connection to Akal Purkh. We want to build that connection. And ode vaste we've got technology through Naam, Bani, Simran, Rani, Bani, everything that gives us power to exist in this dunya as Gursikh, right? And gives us orientation and guidance. But that isn't just a flat set of moral values, that you be a good person, quote unquote, you earn an honest living, like these really kind of reductive things that where Sikhi become symbols. You have like these 5 things, these 5 symbols, that's what makes an Amritari. You wake up, you do your part, that's what makes an Amritari. The Rani and how you're meant to exist in society becomes part of the dominant culture. Like, really interesting now as we're recording this, there's conflict happening in the world right now, and if you look at the position of Sikhs in their various countries, where a Sikh is living in America, or a Sikh is living in Dubai, for example, or a Sikh is living in the UK, their opinions, what I've seen in this moment, align more with the sentiment of the country they're living in rather than the Panth. So the Sikhs in Dubai are looking towards the Dubai's government for guidance, and their position that they have is what the position of the Dubai's government is. The Sikhs in America, many of them are favorable to that government or regime or whatever, or jara Samidi Sarkarya, and they don't really see beyond that in many ways. And similar with the Sikhs in the UK, their understanding is, how does it affect us in the UK? There's not a global understanding, there's not a Panthic understanding, and that is because we're existing in this dunya as citizens. So if our primary relationship to power is through this quality of being a citizen, so the citizen means having legal status, doing all the things the government says that you need to do, which become common sense to us, and we don't really see a conflict between that and Sikhi. For me, like the clearest example of that is Sikhs in the police and the military, where many Sikhs in the police and military, are being good people, will say that they're in the police and the military because they believe in the value of seva and they want to serve their community. And they present that as an original thought. Like that's something they've arrived at independently. Whereas if you look at a more historic perspective of that, this is a phenomena that occurs in the 18th century, where you have the Khalsa existing in the Jatheband in a military form, having their own shastar, having their own forge, and then the British, in order to minimize the possibility of rebellion, begin a recruitment drive in order to pull those young Jawans into the service of the colonial administration and the empire. And they begin a process of really deep set propaganda, the martial race theory, and issuing prachar and songs in Punjabi and Gurmukhi, getting, Sikh administrative bodies to say that serving the King of England is the same as serving Sache Pacha. They're the same, Ovi Sache Pacha, Evi Sache Pacha.
That's crazy.
Yeah, man, these documents exist. And that becomes so deep set that today Sikhs will themselves say, Asi martial race hain, there's no difference between serving the police and the military, because power is now tied to the state, not to the sovereign Khalsa. So when we look at like a Gurdwara Committee functioning under the legislation of the UK to manage a Gurdwara and its administration, and then confusing that somehow with the sovereign functioning of the Sarbat Khalsa, which a key part of the Sarbat Khalsa is the akali. And the akali has always been nishkam. The akali has always been, nirpao, nirvair. They've always been tyagi, but they've always also been jajaru. And they've kept that para. And they're outside of, they're buggy, right? They're outside of the control of the state. So if you don't have the akali functioning as part of the Sarbat Khalsa, then the Sarbat Khalsa doesn't function. Like a Gurdwara Committee isn't going to make a jung decision. They're going to, and also the Gurdwara Committee, the way it works, it becomes a localized body. So essentially functioning like a Jatha, but functioning like a Jatha with the bureaucracy of the state and the authority of the state, because what gives a Gurdwara Committee its legitimacy, winning an election, upholding charity commission regulations, staying within the law, not doing anything illegal. So their authority and legitimacy comes from the state. And within the Gurdwara Committee setup and maaf karna, often the most marginalized and disrespected person is the Granthi Singh. ਜਿਹੜੇ ਗੁਰੂ ਤੋਂ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਨੇੜੇ ਹੋਣੇ ਚਾਹੀਦੇ ਆ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਪੰਥ ਨੇ ਦਰਜਾ ਦਿੱਤਾ, ਗੁਰੂ ਦੇ ਵਜ਼ੀਰ ਆ, right? Like they have the, Baba Deep Singh is the example, right? Akali Jathedar, that have the absolute closeness to the Guru or to the Guru and to the Panth. They are seen as mulazams, employees of the Gurdwara, and not given that space that they need to operate, not given the resourcing that they need to operate, and also not having authority outside of the 21-member committee. And then perversely, if an MP who's from a Sikh family came into the Guru's Darbar, they would be given more authority than anybody. And o sarkar de mulazam hai. So it shows like that deep set logic that's occurring where the sarkar retains legitimacy, authority, credibility. Sikhi becomes irrational. If you start talking about like committee should make a fansla ke, Southall, there's a jung happening right now. The committee should make a fansla that all of the Naujuan get shastar and go fight in this jung. People would say, you're crazy. People say, the committee da kam nahi hai to make any actual decision. Like now, hypothetically speaking, if such a condition arrived, the committee would look at the law and the legislation and its remit and limit its functioning to the limits imposed by the state. So it's very, very different. I would say very different worlds and cosmologies.
They're complete opposites. Yeah, the point you make there about the decent, like Gurdwara in the US, for example, like a Gurdwara in Glasgow and a Gurdwara in London. Forget like America and Canada. It's localized. Whereas before, like in the 18th century, like I was saying earlier, when the Sarbat Khalsa was called, it was decentralized, right, units of Jatha, but ultimately they were still answerable to the Panth, which is why they would come into the Sharan of Guru Sahib into the huzuri of Sache Padshah and leave any Niji there with a fellow Misl Sardar at the door. Whereas, and that's because for them, they had a more holistic and more wholesome view of what the Panth was and what the mandate of the Panth was. So like sovereignty is a key part of that, like that kind of that Padshah Dawa.
It's quite inspiring with the Misls as well, because even though they had at times, accumulated Raj, wealth and everything, that wasn't their objective.
No.
So then even if they were warring outside of the Sarbat Khalsa, when they'd come together, then, it's peace. And it's also them working towards a bigger objective. The objective wasn't just Raj for themselves, because a lot of times they had that. They could have been like, well, we're more powerful than these other Misls, we don't need to come there and discuss what they want to discuss. But the whole point of it was that they want to, as it was the Panthic objective, right? The Panthic Nishana.
And like another way to understand it as well, and I'm not trying to be like negative, or I'm actually quite a believer and a supporter in effective Gurdwara administration. I think committees, I think they're criticised often unfairly and often for the wrong things as well. I think they maintain a space, but it's complicated and it becomes problematic because of hundreds of years and generations of living under the sovereignty of another power. And that's created like really like layered, like, samasyama, like problems.
The biggest issue with the Gurdwara committees is they are flawed by design. So as before these individuals even started this committee or become part of this committee, the structure, like the things we're describing, it's flawed because it's limited, isn't it? So it's by its design.
So the Gurdwara functions as a religious place of worship.
Right.
So it's doing its function, is maintaining a religious place of worship. You can come, Maryada is maintained, you can get darshan of Guru Sahib, Katha, Taddi, Kirtan is happening in that space. But if we look at Baikan Singh Nabba's definition of a Gurdwara, it's not fulfilling all of those 6 points. And we've talked about it in previous podcasts as well, right? Like Akali Bani da Prachar Prasar is a part of it. But it's also about shelter for migrants and destitutes. It's also Dunya de Gyan da ek Kendar. It's also a place, Rogiyan le Dua Khana. It's also a place, for medicine for people. It's also, the final point that he makes is Dushman de Hamle nu rokan vaste ek killa, like a fortress to smash against the tide of oppression. And Gurdwara have always functioned in that way.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. The 6 facets. So like the Adhyatmaka Gyan, and then you've got like the Langar. Those 2 are still in existence primarily, but the other ones that are more kind of socially or politically demanding, we've kind of like swayed from a little, to the point where, like you're saying, that the point about the MP coming in is a great example of like where Sikhs place power, or how they even view power. The fact that they don't see how Guru Sahib has given them that Padshah, like in the banner behind Hamrakat Padshah Dawa, that comes from an episode where the Sikhs are offered, the Nawabi, and they say Hamra Kat Padshah Dawa ja itko ja aglo baba. And this is a defining aspect of the entire 18th century, because they understood, like, this is why Sarbat Khalsa, Gurmata, all of these institutions, they're tied to our Padshah. And they understood, because they were so close to that Guru Kal period, they understood it because they knew that's how the Guru is mobilized as well. I just wanted to finish off quickly in terms of the Gurmata, in terms of its timeline. So, as I said earlier, the Gurmata does start before 1726. The first recorded post-Khalsa Gurmata we have, it comes from Bhai Veer Singh's writings, and they say that the first Gurmata actually takes place in the Battle of Tumkaur. So after the Shaheed Diya of the Vadde Sahibzade, Guru Sahib, when the decision is being made, the Guru Sahib wants to enter the run, the Maidan, the Panj Sikh, the Guru Sikhs that are left, they give a hukum to Guru Sahib that no, they're not going to enter that. So that effectively, according to Bhai Veer Singh, is the first Gurmata. After that, then there's a Gurmata also that Banda Singh Bahadur has in 1710, before Sirhind is conquered and Khalsa Raj is established. And then there are multiple examples which we won't go into because the episode will be entirely on that, but the entire 18th century. But what I wanted to end on was, after even Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Raj, in 1846, so a few years after he passes, there is reference in Shah Muhammad's Jangnama, which was written in 1846, of a Sarbat Khalsa happening. And he specifically writes, he says, Singha Sarya Bet Gurmata Kita, Chalo Jai, Frangi Nu Mariye Ji. So it's specifically he's saying that
Sounds like a very good decision.
pretty much, yeah. So they've seen that how damaging the Farangi has been in terms of their presence already within the Darbar of Lahore and also Punjab. And they're saying the Singhs, he says the Singhs got together, they had a Gurmata, and the decision was to go and fight the Farangi, the British.
The decision is still binding.
The decision is still binding. And it's been reaffirmed, which we'll come on to shortly. But the point being that the Sikhs never ditched the Gurmata. That's all they've known, because you're centering the Guru within that, the Guru Khalsa Panth and the Shabbat.
You mentioned it earlier, Ji, when you went through whether it's by Khan Singh Nabha or by V Singh Ji, about who's making the decisions and decision making. It seems that the people that are making the decisions in all those examples you've given, and today, who makes the decisions, is the difference is huge. Respectfully, I know there's some great people that do seva in the committees, but like these people, Jathadars, people that are like well established in the Panth, got Kamai, like that's kind of, those two things have been separated now.
Kamai is the most important point.
And you know, now, because of the separation of Miri and Piri into religion and politics, where the Gurdwara acts as a religious building and has a bureaucratic function in order to maintain that religious space, politics is relegated to the state. The Sarkar does the political, and we can be part of the politics by being an MP, being in the police, being in the military, being an upstanding member of society. That is seen as the political. And the Panj Pyare here, the absolute supreme authority, they deal purely with religious matters. And if we look at like the Sarbat Khalsa, like there's Singhs in Punjab who have been trying to revive an element of the Sarbat Khalsa by looking at the Gurmata itself as this really important way of moving the Panth forward. Because if we can't make decisions as a Panth, not as localized Gurdwara committees, not as, Panj Singh from a particular Jathebandi giving and deliberating as Guru Roop on, a transgression, but collectively as a Panth, as the Khalsa, if we can't make decisions and we don't have the mechanism to make decisions, then we're missing something very, very profound. And the Sarbat Khalsa, as an institution, not an as an event as well. I think that's a bit of a confusion. Like when we see the Sarbat Khalsa as an event rather than, the Padshahi of the Guru Khalsa in its spiritual, in its Miri Piri form, being enacted in this world. It has like this spiritual, mystical Gurmat element, and it also has the temporal, कि ਅਸੀਂ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, how are we going to function as the Khalsa within it? So it brings it together. And so I was mentioning that Singhs in Punjab have been looking at this process for a number of years. And Ranveer Singh read that the song, like the oath that they're meant to take, like मैं पंथ दे सांझे लाभले आया. So when they try to do this, multiple decision making, Gurmata, proto Sarbat Khalsa type things, just to see if we could come together, deliberate on a single issue and make a decision in order to revive the Gurmata. They had that as part of it. So you'd come there, and I remember watching this on a stream, and some of these people are like really big into like politics in Punjab and part of like national Indian parties, etc. And is almost like a sense of awkwardness. I think some people actually even objected to having that oath, whereas I felt it was a very natural, a purposeful thing to have that oath, right?
It's grounding, isn't it?
It's 100% is grounding, and you're declaring your complete humility and your intentions towards the Panth.
Allegiance. Like it's like when an MP is sworn in, they have their own wordings for their oath. They swear allegiance to the king or the queen. It's exactly, it serves the same function, and it also again demonstrates how the Panth is a sovereign entity. So it's hugely important.
And before you do your point, and then I want to talk about the method and the theory and the execution of the.
Just one last point I've got, And with regards to the Sarbat Khalsa being called, there was also reference to if once they've made the oath, if there were any Jathedars, any individuals who are part of that Sarbat Khalsa gathering, if they renegade on the oath or whatever the task was, they became Tankhaya. So then that was like accepted. And there's so many references from the 18th century. So just want to reiterate that point, just to kind of answer your question about like what is the difference or how should we view the Sarbat Khalsa beyond being just an event. The kind of, I don't like to make comparisons, but for those perhaps watching and listening, if we view it as what it is, which is a spiritual, socio-political event
for me, it's like I said, when any sovereign nation comes together, when the highest generals, leaders, representatives sit in a room to make a decision that's binding on an entire peoples, that is what Sarbat Khalsa is. So whether you want to make a comparison to understand that by looking at the G8 summit or what happens in your local country, that's how we should be viewing what it is. And in order for us to understand and acknowledge and accept that, we have to understand how Midi Pidi go together. And it's not just this religious gathering of priests that come
And
together.
the difference as well is that the accountability, like you mentioned, how many times do we have, we can't make, we wouldn't make the comparison, right, to political parties, but like you're saying, people are watching and they're thinking, how many times have you guys seen political parties come in, mandates, reforms, this, that, the other, they put this, the proposals in front, elected on those proposals and then reneged on them straight away. So like we're saying that the Khalsa, that when they'd sit, and they would be held accountable to that, like you become Tankaya, you'd be like, that's a major thing. And one thing I was listening to the things we're talking, and again you talked about Mahanta. What's the difference? There's why did Guru Sahib give us this model, right? This form of governance to govern ourselves. And two examples come to mind. One, Shamsher Singh was talking about being like a Kalli. So that's the difference as well. Like over here, if there is some people might wrongly see a comparison to like electoral politics or voting or things like that. The difference is the people who are, making this decision, they're of a certain caliber, they're Kalli. So they're not only not subordinate to any system, they're not even subordinate to the Khalsa Raj. So when we have Raj, like the Raj Khalsa, and the Ranjit Singh, the government was different, but the Akalis and the Khalsa is different still.
Can you just explain what is Akali, because it's not a term that you hear that often in today's world?
I think Shera was...
I've got a definition of it. So like on the Punjab side, I was saying the things that came together to deliberate on this, they put together some definitions and looking at the method, the theory of the Sarbat Khalsa, how it's actually executed, and on this question, who are the Akali? And I translated it and I'll read it out. It says, who are the Akali? The Sevadars of Sri Akal Takht Sahib. The aim of the Akali life is to establish and improve Gurdwara, to maintain the sacredness of Maryada, to protect Panthic conduct, to help the oppressed, the suffering, and those who seek the refuge of the Guru Khalsa Panth. The Akali is a lover of Naam Bani, is dependent only on Akal in a state of renunciation of the self, remains in a state of blissful detachment, and hones their warrior spirit. True Akali maintain a position of being extremely bold, meaning they are utterly sovereign. They meet everyone with love. They do not hesitate to sacrifice their lives for the fulfillment of their duties. Akali do not claim ownership of any wealth, property, or land that comes into their hands, nor do they consider the wealth of others their own. However, they do not renounce the world either. Their inclination is that of high consciousness, Naam Rasiya. They are fearless, hateless warriors that have conquered hate and hostility. And ona di agawai, under their leadership of these gun, that's how the Sarbat Khalsa functions. And I know some people may be listening to this and saying it's impractical, but Sikhs like this have existed. Our entire Ityas is built on Sikhs like this, and they can still exist because we've seen as recent as the 80s and the 90s, qualities like this emerge from within the Panth. The individuals that got together to move the Panth from its position of Galami, to recognize what the relationship between our Padshaya sovereignty and the state was, to mount a massive Jangi offensive against the state, to awaken the consciousness of the Panth, or Sangat de vichcho paida hoye. Singh, Singhniya, Pachangi, like we say Baba Fateh Singh ji, Umar de vich bahut chote sige, right? And those types of gun became Pargat, revealed in the Sangat in that period from the 70s, 80s onwards, because the Panth was moving in that direction. So it's not impossible. It's not, I don't think it's abstract at all. I think this is the fundamental building blocks of what makes Sikhi.
It sounds so silly what I'm about to say, but I feel like I've been on so many podcasts with you guys, but it's starting to make a lot more sense to me. It's such a simple thing, like you mentioned earlier about the structures of a Gurdwara Sahib, how Midi and Pidi are separate, because that's why it never makes sense. It can't make sense in the armed Sikh, because your Granthis and your Kirtanis or the Jathas, they're doing one side, and then the committee members are doing the other side, but you don't have
it's been separated. Like you wouldn't see someone as a Granthi in a rare case in those spaces, in the political spaces,
and
right?
the issue as well is that those Gurdwara are not plugged into like a wider consensus, right? So their major objective is to keep things running, keep the lights on, and keep the
Yeah, and the accountability to the Panth of a particular Gurdwara is quite tenuous. It might happen if a Gurdwara hosts a Pracharak who's there's controversy around. Naujawan may gather from across a country, may come together at the Gurdwara to kind of remind them that there is a connection to the Panth. But often I think Gurdwara operate in their own kind of spheres, and it's natural because of the society that we live in, where everything is so separated. In mera karya, mera parvarya, in main meraya, right? Like which Gurbani constantly guides us and tries to lift us out of. So it makes sense that the Gurdwara is representing the kind of the level and what's become normal amongst the individual Sikh. It's just representative of that.
It's our own interaction with Sikhi. If you think about it, that's why I keep referring back to it, because where we're going to get examples of Sikhi from, generally speaking, is when we go to the Guru Gard, right? So whatever we see as the structure there, that's what we're going to interpret. That is what Sikhi is, right?
Yeah.
Even though, like you guys explaining, in these cases, whether that's at Baba Deep Singh Ji, whether that's at Sant Janel Singh Ji more recently, where they've had both sides, and there's many more examples you guys could probably share where actually both combined together, that has been
Puran Gursikh sige.
And talking about the other examples, because a lot of the times when I'm on these podcasts, I like listen to you guys, and it just makes me just like think about different things. But you're talking about that akali, right? The definition of the akali. You can understand why people would be like Sat Bachan, like what their decision is Sirmathe, because I've got a sick of that caliber. And then as Shamsher was talking, I was thinking about Akali Singhs, and I was thinking Akali Phulla Singh, I was thinking of Akali Hari Singh, Nalwa. And then there's no surprise that one of the generals of this time, like we talk about the Sarbat Khalsa later on of 86, by Manbir Singh Chehru, his nom de guerre, or his alias was Hari Singh. So Namchvi and also in character they were the same.
Yeah. With the you asked for the definition of like Akali, right?
Yeah.
What really kind of like helped me understand it was when I watched this explanation by Manbir Singh from Punjab. And it spoke about like in the Puratan Samay, there was 4 kind of categorizations of Sikh leadership, right? So there was the Akalis, and the Akalis were kind of they were like the creme de la creme, right? They were at the top. They exercised Badshahid. They were basically what Shamsher Singh just mentioned with regards to how they operated. And they didn't accept the kind of superiority or the imposed sovereignty of anyone else. They were completely sovereign, which is why we have Akali Phulla Singh at the Kal Takht and Maharaja Ranjit Singh in Lahore, right?
Holding him accountable.
Holding to account. And then below the Akalis, there was the Rats Sardars. And the way he kind of breaks it down is he says that the Rats were individuals. The Rat Sardars were like, they fought for Azadi and rule. But if the opportunity came, they would accept kind of political positions as well. And then below the Rats, there was a Milvartaniya. The Milvartaniya Sikhs basically upheld their own sense of pursuing Raj or self-determination. But they would also accept the authority of others. So like, for example, the Fulkian states. So I know it always comes up, there's a lot of like, after the 1809 treaty that Maharaja Ranjit Singh signs with the British, the entire, essentially the Malwa region below the Satluj falls to the British, right? That's because the Fulkian states were happy to do that. And also it's why they're not really, by some historians, accepted as a missile, the Fulkian missile. And then after that, there's the Chakrels who also then worked under the Mughals as well. So when he described that kind of categorization of the 18th century, it made sense. And all of it is, just to reach at that point, it comes back down to those who embody the paths of the Guru. Like Guru Sahib says, in Garib Sikhon ko diyo pathshahi, ye yaad rakhe, hamri kore aaye. So the Khalsa is now the living sovereign entity of the Guru's Jot. The Guru Granth Sahib Ji is a spiritual Jot, and the Guru Khalsa Panth. So the Akalis can never veer from that. It's just who they are. And they have to be, like you said, of a certain avasta, certain gun. Like Guru Nanak Ji says, Takht behe takhte ki laik. That only those individuals, that's what Sikh polity is. This is why we can't.
You compare that to that orange dude sitting in
This is
America
it,
right now.
exactly.
Who's got that much
He has no like abhyas,
or like
nothing
CEOs of
spiritual.
corporations being brought into Sikh leadership events and saying, look, this is what, Sikh leadership or Khalsa leadership even, like, let's, Sikh ta chalo, and ek padvi deya, but Khalsa's leadership, that this is what it looks like, and I think is really telling, who do we take seriously and who do we mock? Who, I've heard Sikhs, of different Jathebandiyan look at Nihang Singhs, their Maryada as something that's, curious, sometimes comical, and I find it quite tragic. Like they're maintaining insane Maryada, like a Vidya, Korswar, like skills that are an intrinsic part of who we are, and maintaining a certain attitude as well, which is so important to exist in this world. So when we look at Sarbat Khalsa, it makes sense that people look at it as a constitutive, deliberative assembly. Like the parallels often drawn, like it's a parliament, that every Sikh can come together. And today, like the definition of a Sikh as well, it's become a cultural definition. So you could have somebody जिन्ना ने केस कत्ल कीते आ, जिन्ना दी कोई रहनी बहनी नहीं हैगी, and they would describe themselves as a Sikh. And Sikhs themselves would accept them as Sikhs. मेरे परिवार दे विच भी इदां दे Sikh हैगे आ, and in our family units we would look at them and be like, okay, तुम Sikh क्या, because it's a cultural label and it's become something that we aspire to. But it's very different from Sahajtari, because jo Sahajtari Sikhs ga, wo fir bhi they stay within the Maryada of the Sikh, right? So ek ta wo ho gaya. Duja, like the Khalsa coming together is very different. This isn't a representative gathering of anybody that claims affinity to the Panth, or kise samay they pardade were Amritari, so therefore they have the name Single Kaur associated to them, or that they see they have a personal attachment. Or how did some American describe it once? They were like self-described Sikh or something like that, right? कि मैं कहता मैं Sikh हैं, right? So the Sarbat Khalsa, the individuals that come together, ekta kalli ho gaya, who have the authority. So Aam Sikh can't call, Sadde Varge can't call a Sarbat Khalsa. Sarbat Khalsa is called by a Jathebandi. And amongst those Jathebandi, jere akalli ya, o sadda dinde Sarbat Khalsa da. Those that come together.
Do you want me to ask you, how do you become the Akali? How do you become?
Panth recognizes you.
Okay.
Panth recognize you. ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵੀ ਹੋਏ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਵੀ ਸਿੱਖ ਸੀਗੇ ਜਾਂ ਸਿਰਲੱਥ ਯੋਧੇ ਮਰਜੀਵ ਰਹੇ, ਤਾਂ ਪੰਥ recognize them. ਪੰਥ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਛਾਣਿਆ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਰਹਿਣੀ ਬਹਿਣੀ ਚੋਂ. Like Sant Janel Singh, their first Thakallas, their nickname was Sant Janel Singh Abhyasi. And they were recognized because of their Rani Beni. When anybody who stayed in a Jatha or in a Dal knows that there's no hiding in the Jatha or the Dal. When you would sing Pata lag gyanda kere vele uth, then you get a glimpse of that when you go to Sikhi camp. Like your Rani is then for the Sangat to see. Sare nu pata kaun kitte seva karta. So Panth has the capacity to recognize. So those that come together, ekta oho Rani Beni de vich hone chahide, Amritari hone chahide. Duja, on top of that, they have to be giving the Savand to the Panth, and on top of that they have to be have a recognized seva within the Panth, because Vidya Sakharya, Gurbani Sarkarya, Shastra di Vidya Sakharya, whatever there is, there has to be a connection and a recognition ke e Panth de vich apna hissa pa reha. Not just I'm Amritari and I wake up and do my Amrit Vela. That's the bare minimum. Beyond that, there are steps as well to come together. So when the Sarbat Khalsa of these individuals come together, they then make the decision in the form of Jathebandis. So the purpose of it is a collective expression of the Khalsa to represent the greatness of the Guru Khalsa Panth. That's why the Sarbat Khalsa comes together, to represent those Uche Gun of the Panth. And it's usually called Akal Takht Sahib in the presence, in the Hazuri of Guru Granth Sahib Ji. And that's the space where the Khalsa, and in times of war, it can be, Sarbat Khalsa can be called in other places as well.
Oh, so it doesn't just have to be a Akal Takht.
It doesn't have to just be a Akal Takht Sahib. Jitte samay de vich Sikhs cannot gather in Akal Takht Sahib, because there has been, then any place can be chosen for the Sarbat Khalsa.
Is there any examples of that?
There's reference to Keskar Sahib.
Okay.
Being called, yeah.
2018.
Yeah. And though that gathering, but the Sarbat Khalsa can only again be called by the Akali Singhs in those instances. So when the Sarbat Khalsa is called, then firstly, a person who for their avasta is recognized and approved and a respected Panthic figure that everyone can agree on, that person has the duty then of informing this collective Sarbat Khalsa what the issue is that is going to be decided upon, deliberated upon that day. So once that Singh is appointed by the collective.
Is that the Jathidar you call it?
No, there's not the Jathidar.
Okay.
This is the Sakhi Singh. This they have the function of with the gatherings being called. Out of the gathering, somebody is selected to be the Sakhi Singh who says this is the issue we're deliberating, and then that Sakhi Singh then selects Panj Singh who are Keni Karni de Pure. And then,
What does that mean?
so they're complete in their word and deed. So, the Panth recognizes them, that there's no difference. Like, the examples we can give from our recent Atiyas, like Sanjanel Singh Varge Surme, that, there's no difference in between, their reni and their actions. They're not political in the sense of dunyavi, niche politics, that jo marji keh den, or they can exist in a world where they can say something and not not be that person or not even believe that. It's like they're living in that duality, right?
They walk the talk. They don't.
And the thing is,
100%.
they prove themselves through times as well. So like, Santanel Sinji, I always think about this as well, that the Damdami Tiksal at that time in the 70s when they emerged, it wasn't as huge as it is today. Many people even in Punjab weren't aware of it. And yet it was, so they weren't elected by anyone, they weren't part of the Akali Dal, they weren't part of any political party. So, and when the Panth faced challenges from the 70s onwards, he dwarfed his opponents or his contemporary other leaders in this, like Akali Dal, etc. So it's through his actions, like Msher Singh talking about, Keni Kathni de Pure, that like they would say one thing and do another thing, right? Famously during the Darbar Sahib attack, right, the Akali leaders all swore that when the tanks come or the soldiers come, sade chhattiyan de utte they'll come. They unhone sare Akal Takht te ardas ਕੀਤੀ ਸੀ to do shahidi. They did the took an oath of shahidi, and they all mukkar gaye sige. So that the reason why these people become like chosen is because of their actions, right?
And you mentioned it earlier, but when you say the Panth chooses them, who is the Panth? Is it Amritari Sikh? Is it whoever turns up on that day? Who are the actual Panth that are picking these people?
So when the Sarbat Khalsa gathering is called and those types of Sikhs emerge that, have Rani Bani, have a Hissa and Panthic Seva, give the Swant to the Panth, that collective gathering is the Panth, is the sentiments of the Panth. So amongst that, the Sakhi Singh picks Panj Singhs and makes that appointment. Let's go, look at these will be the Panj Singhs who are Keni Karni de Pure.
Yeah.
And then from amongst, then the Panj Singh are declared to the Sangat. And then the Sangat is then asked, Katti hui Sangat of the Sarbat Khalsa, then they're asked if they have any objections. So they can raise an objection against any one of those appointed Panj Singhs. And then once that process is clear, no objection is raised, then the Panj Singh are positioned in Guru Sahib's Hazuri and the Sarbat Khalsa formally begins. And the Singh who made the Khalsa Ji aware, the Sakhi Singh, of the issue being deliberated and who declared, these are the Panj Singh, they are then, after the approvals been given of the collective, they then see in Maharaj's Hazuri and do Tabyadi Seva of Maharaj during the deliberation. See, this is the difference, right? So now MP aajaye, and it's like, somebody important has come into the Guru's Darbar, whereas the Khalsa is making decision. The person who informs the Khalsa of the issue, not even have a formal role in the Sarbat Khalsa, they inform the Khalsa of the issue, they select Panj Singh, everyone agrees, then also Sakhi Singh nu Maharaj de Tabya bathaya janda. Like, look at the level of Satkar, the level of Nirta with Guru, the understanding. This is a complete different functioning, right?
And I say this very respectfully, but and there are great Guru Sikhs out there to do like Pradhan, the Seva, if you want to call it, in a Guru Kar. But a lot of the Pradhans that I've seen, I wouldn't see them being able to sit on Guru Sahibji's Tabia and do the Seva. I'm just giving that comparison.
One of the most hardest, difficult seva where you have to be 100% on point, to namba that seva. You got to understand many, many different things of the intimate relationship between a Sikh's Rani Bani and Satkar of Guru in order to fulfill that seva. It's super.
And a different thing as well, like you see the qualities in these Guru Sikhs and in these leadership positions. the example of when we gave about the Nawabi that was offered to by Kapoor Singh, both him and Sanjay Singh ji both rejected it out of hand. Like they didn't want that position. So that's the difference as well. You see that those people who they're selected, they've given hukum to take the seva, but given their character and their like nimrata, they don't actually want to take that kind of position. Sanjay Singh ji was happy doing his abhyas. He did not want to become the mukhi of the taksal. But ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਜਦੋਂ ਉਹ ਸੇਵਾ ਸੌਂਪਦੀ we were given that seva.
Right. Yeah, so once that process begins, Sakhi Singh Sahib is formally seated in Guru Sahib's tabia. The Panj Singh then choose from amongst themselves, the approved Panj Singh that have gone through the process, they'll choose a representative, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਇੱਕ ਨੁਮਾਇੰਦਾ ਆਪ ਚੁਣਦੇ ਆ. And then the proceedings begin. So then the suggestions of everyone that are present are listened. Like Ramir Singh was talking about that, the oath that's taken, they understand why they're here. They're here for primary allegiance to the Panth. They're here to deliberate on an issue and make a decision that benefits the Panth as the Guru Khalsa. And then everyone gives their suggestions. The Panj Singh then deliberate on those suggestions and announce the decision. And that decision is called the Gurmata, which is then binding on all of the Sikhs as a hukum of the Guru. So then that process is then complete of the Sarbat Khalsa. That deliberation is complete. And also the decision that's made, the Gurmata that's made, then the Panth then enacts on that. And we see that jumping forward from this time period to like 1986, when the Sarbat Khalsa is reformulated, Sikhs revive the process, try to go through all of these steps and issue decisions that then become binding on the Panth. So it's very, very different to how I've often heard it described when you actually look at its functioning.
Sounds amazing.
How have you heard it described? You mean?
Like, that same type of thing, right? Like it's like a parliamentary type style gathering, and anybody can call it like, Mami Khalsa, main sadlunga Sarbat Khalsa, every Sikh is the Guru. I've heard as well people talk, but Guru in every Sikh isn't the Guru. Guru ta panj Sikh hai jadon ikkathe hunde, right? When we give deg as well, asi panja da hissa pehla vandde ha. This seemed to katha, and one Sikh was saying that we shouldn't when we do that panja da vartara, we shouldn't count the vartara. We should say the names of the panj pyare, because ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਨਾਜ਼ਰ ਮੰਨ ਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਮਰਿਆਦਾ ਪੂਰੀ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, right? Like ਉਹ Guru ਆ. So the how a Sarbat Khalsa is called, who can participate in it, is not even like on a parliamentary level. It's not like I've got some ideas, minnu vi time deo, you can't even get admission into the building. So why is it when it comes to Sikh issues, the criteria, what is the bar? Like firstly, they don't understand there is a bar. Secondly, they're like, there shouldn't be a bar because this is religion and we're all one, and Guru Nanak Dev Ji said ek oankar. So
it comes full circle to the point you made earlier about that break in Miri Biri. So like you're talking about, Rehetwa, Nitnimi, Gursikhs, they're a certain caliber.
That give the Swand and also do Panthik Seva.
There you go. Yeah. So virle hone like, it's like.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And are you now going to move towards 86, or is there other examples they want to give from beforehand, or how do we get to 86?
I think just one thing I want to touch upon is, just in case obviously people are watching this and thinking, to try to really stress the significance of why Guru Sahib gave us this institution, gave us this process. A couple of months ago, a Gursikh came to stay at my house, and like he made Shardai for us, and I was looking into the process afterwards at all the like banj, maggage and all these things, and I was kind of almost like overwhelmed, thinking like, Maharaj gave us this like amazingly nutritious, amazingly thing that the things in the dal had 3 times a day. So, and sometimes because we've got this lens that we look at everything that like the West does as better, as more modern, etc., that sometimes we overlook like the significance and why these things are given to us. So even with the Sarbat Khalsa, like one of the things that the Gore recognized when they obviously when they were looking to try to tackle the Khalsa and in their evaluation of them, is that the biggest issue that they had was that they're all autonomous, they're all sovereign. And that whether you have, there's a direct quote, I remember like the Gurdwara was writing at the time, and he was saying whether there's a Jatha out of 500 Singhs or 5 Singhs, whether he has like, thousands of like miles of land or whatever, or he has like nothing, whether he has like a gold shastra or he's got like a stick, their voice is the same. So how do you control a people like that? So the same way Sanjay Sanji wasn't given like a mandate by anyone, you know, we're all autonomous, right? We're all sovereign. We, you know, the Khalsa is anyway, and they can act as direct, you know, under the direct orders of the Guru. So that was one of the most significantly important characteristics of the Khalsa. That how do you try to, you know, because you can't corrupt one Jathadar. And if you take one Jathadar, you know, you bribe them, you assassinate them, whatever, you know, it didn't have the same effect on the Khalsa. You know, Gadda Singh, Bhutta Singh, they weren't deputed by anyone or was sent to do this. So we're all autonomous. And it's the same thing with, like, you know, by Byan Singh and by Satwan Singh. You know, they didn't need to take any kind of decision from anyone, any kind of hukum from anyone. Like, they just performed the actions that they believe that they, you know, that Guru Sahib, they're only Sanmukh to Guru Sahib, essentially. So that was the most, you know, powerful thing about the Khalsa. And I think Bhai Mandeep Singh was talking about is how that even during the harshest times when we're living in jungles, the Khalsa still had this process. They still got together wherever it was to make decisions because they needed to have that thing. And that's the most kind of, it gave us that strength. And these are the kind of institutions that were then undermined. So when the Gora came in and brought in the SGPC, these are like elected people, you know, who you can control, like a tiny group of people who control like the whole Panth, right? The whole institutions in India. And also the act, you know, the SGPC is set up by an act of parliament. So any changes or anything would have to go through the Indian parliament. So even if we had like a majority, we said this before, even if we had like a majority in Punjab, we had like a pro-Khalsa government in Punjab, if we didn't have the backing of every other state in India, we couldn't make any changes to the SGPC, which ultimately has a lot of control. So the point I was trying to make, stress, was that there's a reason why we were given these institutions. It's not like this is the institution we had at the time. Things have gone on, things have progressed or are better now. If you look at the way politics works today, you know, we talked about the referendum in Scotland. We're sitting in Scotland today. They had a referendum on independence. 49 voted to be independent and 51. And the other thing is, even the ones who voted against independence, it was, you know, like there was like a massive campaigns, propaganda. And again, it's the electorate who are voting who are not always the right kind of type of people. Maybe they're not fully clued up on the decision. And they've made a decision arguably to their detriment, right? Same thing with Brexit. And how is that a kind of effective system that you got 49% of the population who is like deeply against the way the country's going? But the Sarbat Khalsa, like when Reed Singh was talking, that they didn't, I think Mandeep Singh was saying as well, like they would sometimes be days, weeks, that they would not, like, you know, it wouldn't be like a one-day event, like everyone throw your hands up and, like, you know, etc. It was something that like they would, you know, deliberate on and work out something. So consensus building, which takes longer, but has longer lasting impact and is much more, is a better system.
Yeah, you know, for me, the most phenomenal aspect of this is when we look at the 18th century, like the Sikhs just don't lose sight of that. They just go again and again and again, like Zakaria Khan Zulm, Ahmad Shah Abdali's invasions, Shota Ka Lukara, Vadda Ka Lukara. They for them it's a genuine fight for existence. But that point you made about, like, you know, how the British recognized or saw that it was because they saw it, the Khalsa saw themselves as sovereign. This is why, like in Panth Prakash, Ratan Singh Pangu, he says Khalsa hove khud khuda jim khubi khub khudaye aan na mane aan ki sache bin padshai. This is just something that the Khalsa embodied, because they knew nothing else. They didn't know any like subedari politics or, like, you know, subservient rule or asking the Mughals for this. Whenever there was an instance of them coming, when the Mughals came, when they got fed up of fighting with the Khalsa and they said, okay, we'll give you this space, the Khalsa were like, no, we're not going to take it. We're going to establish it on our own grounds. So all of these things point to that, how central Padshah was. They were just, it never really left them. And even now, even after Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Raj falls, the Sikhs continue, which is why we then culminate in 1986, which we'll come on to, is that they understood how significant this is for Sikh existence. Like, we're talking about all these like lofty ideals of creating like an egalitarian society, an equitable society where 49% vote counts as well. In order for us to do that, there has to be political autonomy and governance. So it's part and parcel. It's a part of Khalsa Sikh DNA. So there's no breaking away from that.
And you're like, it's the importance as well of the ability to make decisions that benefit solely the Panth from the position of Panthak autonomy, where you're not thinking like a Galam Nagrak, like a citizen who's living under the state and who can't think beyond, like, if I'm in trouble, I'm going to call the police, like, which is become, again, like, what's become common sense. Anybody that's been involved in any form of seva understands that we don't teach our kids to do that. We teach our kids to be shastartari. And in order to defend themselves, you've got to understand how to defend yourself so you can look after yourself and you can help other people if they need help as well. It's such an important part of how we want to exist in Samaj, because we understand कि किसी भी समय समाज बदल सकता, सिक्खां दे खिलाफ हो सकता. We've experienced that society can be against you. Like in Delhi, November, when we talk about the violence that the state inflicted, and then also the examples of where Sikhs resisted and where Sikhs had their shastar and they relied on their shastar, their gurpir, they were able to survive that. Whereas those that had handed their weapons to the police then watched the mobs commit heinous violence against them as, the police stood there. So the power of making a decision is essential to life. If we can't make decisions, then we can't respond to circumstances. We can't respond to challenges. We're looking to others, whether it's our local, Gurdwara Committee, whether it's our councillors, MPs, prime ministers, the United Nations, the so-called international community and its so-called international law. We're always looking to be participants in that. And that somehow, if that we can raise the Sikh Awaj, and it's been presented to us in many different ways over many different years, even during the 80s and the 90s. I mean, this stuff, it wasn't as if this was what's happening now is new, or like, the dynamic we talked about, the MP coming into the Darbar. It's just the Sikh response is far more Ghulam now than it was in the 80s, because in the 80s, Indira came to the Guru's Darbar as well. Also, some maybe Sikhan da response siga, and it wasn't what we see today. When she came into the Darbar, jump in and
yeah, during the it was the Shahidi Purb of Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji. I think it was Bangla Sahib Gurdwara in Delhi, and everyone, obviously it was quite a massive event, and all the like Jathadars and all the Dharmic leaders were there, and Sant Kartar Singh Ji was there as well. And when Indira came, everyone got up and like turned to her and like was greeting her. And then Santji rebuked her and like the Sangat quite a bit, and he said that if she gave her head for every every roam of hair she has, apna sees balidan kar de like to the Guru, it still wouldn't be enough to what they owe to the Khalsa, because she's from like the Kashmiri Pandit family, and what Santji said was there's no one who's bigger than the Guru in the Guru's Darbar, and like we shouldn't be behaving like this.
Yeah, and so having leaders like that are guiding you constantly, reminding you of your Padshahi, reminding you that you Raj Pag de Varas hain, like that is such a powerful thing. And then from there, and then from being Shastartari, like actually Shastartari, not like, Aj de samay de vich, like, Lasansi Hathiar or whatever the law permits of the time, during all of our Atiyas, all of the weapons we've had have been outside of the remit of the law. From the Mughal, nobody else has the authority to do Kor Sawar, to keep Shastar, the Brahman caste system that said if you're not of that particular caste, todde vaste Shastar chakna gunaya, you will be suffer, your arm will be cut off if you touch a weapon, Bani Sunni Manaya, molten lead was poured into their ears. So it's always been outside of the remit of the law. When Singhs and Singhni are walking around with RPGs and assault rifles in the 80s, in the Parkarma of Darbar Sahib, they weren't licensee hatiyar. They weren't like single shot rifles and shotguns that the government gives you permission for. These are fully automatic weapons that the state security forces didn't have at that time. The police didn't have the weapons that the Singhs had at that time. They established their own channels. Same parallels are drawn from the Mughaliya Sama, when Sikhs would rob the weapons. How many Sakhiyan do we have that Sikhs would go into a battle, they would see the Mughals have firearms, they would retreat from that battle, go into their camp at night, steal their weapons and attack them in the morning, establishing their own supply line. So when you're truly sovereign in that sense, jitte tuadde kol naam bani ta shastran da pair aaya, and you say that you actually can exist in a form where Shastaran di jiri mahanata as Gurpir is visible and present in this world. So you have the most advanced, best hatiyar you can have. And at that point, the decision and the deliberating is naturally going to look different. If somebody's doing a hamla on you and and you don't have that type of shastar, or you're not able to exist in that form, then naturally the decision making is going to look different. Then it's going to be, why aren't the police protecting us? Why isn't international law defending us? So if we look right now in the dunya, the qawms that have the ability to enter into the battlefield on their own terms, they exist. And they can fight, and they can respond, and they can alter the history of political geographies, as we see in West Asia, all of the conflict that's happening there, is because they've developed their indigenous capabilities to respond, that they exist, and that they can defeat the ego of powers that think that we're going to walk all over you because ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਦਮ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ ਉਹ ਜਿੱਡੇ ਵੱਡੇ ਹਥਿਆਰ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਆ ਦੁਨੀਆ 'ਚ ਕਿਸੇ ਕੋਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੇ. And they were under a false illusion, and ਹੁਣ that's naked in front of the world, like whatever the temporary leaders of the American system believe, ਦੁਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਆ, there's no denying it. So that decision making looks very, very different. Then you can make a decision कि ਅਸੀਂ ਜਾਂ ਰਾਜ ਕਰੇ हैं ਜਾਂ ਲੜ ਮਰੇ हैं. And you can make a fainsla like that, right? Like either we're going to rule or we're going to fight and die. And the Chote Sahibzade, they made those types of sovereign decisions. Gurmata to cut nahi siga, like the fainsla that they made as bache, being given all of the dunyavi lalcha, they made the decision na कि ਅਸੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸ਼ਹੀਦੀ ਪ੍ਰਵਾਨ ਆ, ਪੰਥ ਸਾਡੇ ਤੋਂ ਕੁਰਬਾਨੀ ਮੰਗਦਾ, ਅਸੀਂ ਕੁਰਬਾਨੀ ਦੇਣੀ ਆ. The decision, to today's day and age, the logic of the state and subservience, the logic of the Ghulam would say, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਬੂਲ ਕਰ ਲਓ Islam, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਅਹੁਦਾ ਲੈ ਲਓ, take a position, slowly we can change the system from within, they're not all bad, don't worry, I can convince the low level officiaries of the government to do a fansla in the haq, trust me, once I'm in there, I'm going to open the door for the rest of you. And we've seen it.
The thing is, the reason why the 80s and 90s is a golden period in Sikh history is because those Guru Sikhs looked to the Guru and Guru Jathas and like the Jathas of the Khalsa and looked to how we should operate. How, because sometimes people ask these like, I was going to say retarded, but we can't say that anymore. Ridiculous. Sometimes people ask these ridiculous questions now. Oh, Khalistan, who's going to be the prime minister? Who's going to be this? And,
run a Gurdwara.
Yeah, and it's like, the Khalsa of the 80s and 90s, they weren't looking to like, I don't know who, Winston Churchill or something. They were looking at Akali, Fullah Singh Akali, Hari Singh. That's who they were taking their kind of guidance from and their inspiration from, and that's why and we need is the people watching. It's really important to evaluate these systems and these decisions and the processes of the Khalsa, and if you need to compare them to what the world has now, and see why it was we were given this system. I mean, look what's happening in America as well. There's times when the government shuts down because the two parties can't agree. The Congress shuts down. They can't put decisions through. Last thing I heard, I think the TSA workers are getting paid and their salaries. So it's an absolute mess, like the Western political systems. The way how a tiny group of people in the world can control global politics, through lobbying, etc., etc. So, look at these systems more critically and look at our systems and see, where the benefits lie.
And if you don't have the ability to make decisions, then you're in a trap. We look at a lot of issues within the Panth and we say, why can't this one issue be resolved? Why can't we resolve this one issue? Like in the Panth, there's no shortage of anything. Resources, Javania, Jovi, there's no shortage of it. But why can't we make a decision to move forward? Because those processes have deliberately been undermined and demolished. The authority from the Panth, from what the Panth values, is shifted to the state. The state becomes supreme over it. And that is something that we have to rectify going forward generationally. Otherwise, we're in a really serious predicament. I think like it's really profound if you think about it. Like, of course, we're in, the situation that we're in right now because we can't collectively take decisions. how do we recognize those types of Sikhs? How do we put them into positions of authority and power within the Panth? How do we then reformulate Jathebandiyan? How do we become Jathebanda Sikhs? Because that's not even part of Sikh advocacy or the Panthik agenda. Like we talk about it in like abstract terms, but we don't say Sanu Jatheband hona pena in order to now move forward in the world. We need to exist as the sovereign Khalsa. Like that's not like a Panthik focus. It's very much resource and attention orientated, which is a symptom of the Samaj that we're living in. It's like if we can get enough attention from the Gora, if they can recognize us as being worthy, or we can gain a resource, then with that resource and with that attention, we can then move forward. We can then resolve the issues, not on the qualities that the Khalsa respects, right? Not on our abhyas, not on our Rani Bani, not on the quality of being Jatheband, but on like fleeting things that have never been part of the equation. Because the Khalsa has been in many situations where they haven't had resources, they haven't had anything, right? Like Bhutta Singh, Garja Singh, for example, but it didn't alter the way they made decisions, or it didn't take away their ability to make decisions. If that makes sense.
It just sounds as simple as, to me, when I'm looking at it, we can't make decisions because someone else is making the decisions for us, and we don't feel empowered to, even though we should be. But it's like, it feels foreign. All the stuff you're saying to what the version of Sikhi that I was taught when I was a kid, this stuff doesn't exist. It's completely foreign.
That's a really key point, and I was going to make it earlier when you mentioned about like that empowerment, because and it comes down to how we view Sikhi, innit? Like how do we view Sikhi as this sovereign entity that encompasses both Miri and Piri, or do we view it as just a religion? Because actually, if you view it as Sikhism, the 5th largest religion in the world, it actually makes complete sense.
Yeah,
whatever they're saying, right? But that is one perspective of what the Sikh is, and that's completely foreign to, I would say, 400 years of our Itihas. It's only the last 175 years, really, where this imposition of being a religion has been enforced upon us, to the point where we ourselves are telling our own children in our own Gurdwara, in our own homes, that this is what we are and something we should be proud of. So that's a huge, that's maybe a conversation from the topic, but like that empowerment will come from when we understand and see that we are a sovereign entity.
And now if we can move the podcast forward to marking 40 years, 86, what is the backstory to 1986 Sarbat Khalsa, forming, coming together? Where do we start from?
So Sarbat Khalsa 86 takes place 2 years after the Jang at Darbar Sahib in June 1984. So firstly, like looking at that timeline from June 84 and then November 84, where the state unleashes, its grand kind of plan of curtailing all of the rising Sikh political sentiments, all of the rising kind of activity that's taking place in villages, the message of Darbar Sahib, the shahadatan, the qurbaniyan that the Panth demanded at that time. In order to stop that from bearing fruit, the state embarks upon this massive program of violence. So in that environment where there's, curfews, where, a huge portion of Sikh leadership has been shaheed, the Panth is trying to reformulate this question of decision making, and they're coming together at a crucial moment within a really short space of time, in order not to let the events of Darbar Sahib 1984 become a past history or become a tragic occurrence. So you see like this huge military operation that tries to destroy all of the Panth's leadership, because again, like egoist powers think that the authority is in Akal Takat. It's something about Akal Takat and something about Darbar Sahib that's in the buildings themselves. Like that's why the Mughals, how many times they've invaded Darbar Sahib, they filled in the Sarovar, demolished Harbandar Sahib, demolished Akal Takat, but the authority is within the collective Khalsa. So in order to bear fruit on those Qurbaniyan, various Jathebandiyan, primarily Jatha Pindra, whose Mukhi Sanjanel Singh Shahadat pushed us on this path, and whose a leadership through this period awoken that spirit within the Sikh Panth in it, that Tusi Galamia, and that you need to move forward now. So 86 emerges in that environment. And obviously that has a much larger, from the 70s, and we've covered this in, different podcasts, the whole series in June 1984, we look at a Sikh struggle, what Sikhs are fighting against, why they're fighting. So 86 happens in this environment in a really, really short period of time, arguably to give us more progress between 84 and 86 than we've seen pantically, from 95 to now. So from 86, it launches this new phase of the struggle. And that is a really, really short time in 2 years. And between 95 and now, it's a huge period of time. The Panth hasn't moved the struggle forward, how it was moved forward in that crucial decade of insurgency.
Yeah. It's like, in Punjabi they say, like a 18ਵੀਂ ਸਦੀ ਦਾ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਦੁਹਰਾਤਾ ਨੇ, that specific 2-year period between 84 and 86. We've not seen anything like it. And even like when we look at the previous decades building up to it, it was because of the effects of the colonial encounter, the fact that the Lahore Darbar of Maharaja Ranjit Singh was dismantled. In the previous section we spoke about, this kind of the idea of how Miri Siddhant has been there from the offset. But after 1849, there was a massive push by the state, primarily the British state, then equally the Indian state has kind of continued on that front as well, whereby the Sikhs are just the religious people.
Yeah.
So when we look at 84, we look at a lot of the narrative and the rhetoric around 84. Even the response that comes from the Jujaru Jathabandiya, it's then labelled as religious fundamentalism / extremism, because the Sikhs also sadly have, because they've internalized that, they're not able to see it as clearly as they ought to. But when we read our Puratan Itihas, we can see there that what the Sikhs were fighting for wasn't just the religious pursuit, right, quote unquote. It was because of the hukum from the Guru from the Akal Takht. So there's also that's had a massive effect on it all. So what happens in 84 to 86? That's even the year 1985. We were speaking about this just recently about how it was a gradual kind of progression towards the Sarbat Khalsa. So Sikhs would still get together. So in 1985. It was during Hola Mohalla, right?
Yeah.
And there was a kind of a genuine sense that something was brewing within the Sikh circles, that there was this sense of like injustice. Obviously, we know that November had happened, so Indira Gandhi had been assassinated. Beyond Singh had attained Shahidi. At this point, Satwan Singh and Khair Singh would have been in prison, awaiting their sentencing. So in March 1985, at Keskar Sahib, during Hola Mohalla, the Panth gets together as well, and there's a reference to how there was very fiery speeches given, Tadi Vara was sung, and they were all speaking to the spirit of Sikh resistance and Padshai. And then we see towards later on in that year, there's different samagams that take place. For example, when they commemorate November 85, 1 year since the Shaheed by Beyond Singh. And in that program, Bibi Bimal Kaur is given a Sanman from the Panth. Their children are raised up, and there is this kind of like a sense of, we spoke earlier about empowerment. That's very much there within the Sangat. So 86. By the time you get to 86, and these guys will touch on it a bit more, there's a genuine kind of build up, and it's very, it's not in isolation. It's on the back of 84, and then what takes place in 85 as well.
And it shows as well very clearly that the so-called Panthic political parties, the Akali Dal, they completely fail. Like even before, like the Sarbat Khalsa and before Darbar Sahib attack in 84, those that had faith that by being part of the state structure that we could resolve Sikh issues, that doubt had been completely erased from their minds. And 86 solidifies that even after, if you want to look at it from the point of view of a Sikh citizen, that 1984 was a tragedy, and that it was genocide and it was human rights violations. Even from that perspective, the Akali Dal leadership weren't able to progress the Sikh cause in any way. So it shows a complete and abject failure, and it creates that environment where the Khalsa is looking inwards to their institutions and reorganizing to resolve their affairs according to Gurmata and according to their traditions. That's why it becomes so crucial in that moment. It exposes, the massive gulf between Panthic leadership of Sant Jarnail Singh and the Shaheeds and those that call themselves Sikhs and are involved in the structures of the state that is causing this oppression. Because even at this point, I don't think any Akali Dal leader resigns from the Indian parliament or hands in, resignation in protest to the Indian parliament.
The thing is, and this kind of this goes into the criticism that we had about the political parties themselves, is what else would they have been able to do? I mean, this was on the back of the civil disobedience, the Tarmid Morcha. So what was left to the Akali Dals? What was left to the Akali Dal? What could they have done?
In their arsenal,
Yeah, there's literally nothing they have nothing left, right? So they did the peaceful agitations, they did resignations, they did loads of different programs during the Tarmid Morcha, but they exhaust all methods because that's the methods that they're given, right? So it's a state party. And after the attack on Darbar Sahib, the Akali leadership, they ultimately side with the government, recognizing that that's where their journey stops there. The tanks pull up, the army's there, and that's as far as a political party they can go.
That also speaks to, I think you've spoken previously, maybe on the previous podcast, about how like Santji's Morcha, like with the Bandi Singhs, was ran in parallel to the Tarmiyut Morcha that was initiated by the Akalis, right? And so therefore that was their end. And ultimately, because they have accepted the allegiance and the superiority of the state and the state apparatus, they couldn't go beyond that.
No.
Which is why then, like Shamsher was saying, then it becomes in the Panth. Earlier you mentioned about the capability to make decisions, right? It then naturally kind of evolves within the Panth. And that decision making, you could call it it's almost like the Kirpa of the Guru. It comes through Sangati Roop. When the Sangat are coming together, like I said, in Holla Mohalla in March, later in throughout the summer months as well, then in November time, then in December as well, it's slowly building because there is this sense of, there's this sense of injustice and that we need to do something with regards to what's happened with the Hamala. But also I think there is, because of the reawakening that Sant Jarnail Singh had initiated, there is this level of like understanding like who we are as a people, and that that the essence of feeling Ghulam was, I think, being felt across across Punjab.
And with Santji in 84 and the Shahidi of all the Singhs, what was the leadership looking like after that? Who took over that leadership? And you're talking about the Singhs getting together, the Sangat getting together in 85 at Holla Mohalla. Were there key figures? And then how did that lead to 86?
I think after 84, after the military gained control of the entire Darbar Sahib complex, the so-called Sikh leadership, the Akali Dal, etc., immediately compromised with the government. And that's off the back of a huge battle. Tanks have been sent in, all the Sangats Shaheed. We don't even understand the full scale of what's happened there militarily. But the Akali Dal government immediately looked towards the Indian government and re-legitimized them. So shift the authority from the Shaheeds, from the Akal Takat, from the entire Morcha, from the commitment, the struggle of a generation back into the hands of the state. And that's where figures like Longowal, who wants to compromise with the state and wants to use this as an opportunity to reach some kind of resolution and turn our struggle for our Badshahi and Raj into political demands. He's assassinated by Jujaru leadership at that time.
So Longowal was the Akali Dal president at this time, and he was they call him the dictator of the Morcha. So the Tarmid Morcha was led by the Akali Dal in July 1982, and they reached out to Sant Jarnail Singh to join forces, to join their platform, to support the Tarmid Morcha because they didn't have credibility, they didn't have support. And at the time, Santji had initiated a Morcha to have by Amrik Singh and Baba Tara Singh released from jail, who were arrested on arbitrary charges. So they said to Sant Jarnail Singh that why don't you join with us and then you could spearhead this Morcha, and it's for rights of all Punjabi Sikh, under the Anandpur Sahib resolution. And Santji saw this as an opportunity to spread his message to a larger Sikh audience, and also to unveil what the reality of these systems are, of democracy, etc. So when Sant Jarnail Singh came on board, he said that we will do this, but we will not take one step back from the Anandpur Sahib resolution, and we'll take this to its inevitable end. So he had all of the other Akali leaders take Sohan Unhone Chakkiyan Siga to that we would all die, but we won't take a step back.
And we covered this in the last podcast. Anandpur Sahib resolution, was that something that came from the Akali Dal or from Santaji?
It came from the Akali Dal. It was drafted by Sardar Kapoor Singh in 1973 as a list of economic, social, political rights and demands that the Sikh had at that time. And Santaji knew from the very start that the government was never going to accept any of these demands. It was never going to give us like further rights or freedoms as legitimate as they were. But he wanted to use this example to awaken the consciousness of the Sikh, right? And you mentioned earlier about how if there were other notable figures, Santaji Singh's life work was the Sarbat Khalsa. For me, sometimes people have this misconception that he never mentioned Khalistan, but what he said was that we're not speaking in favor of it right now. Ajay Sikh Chopya. But if you look at the work that Santaji Singh was doing, from 1978, Santaji Singh was an integral figure, a nucleus around a core revolutionary organizing of Sikh Nojawan, which included the setting up of organizations such as the Babbar Khalsa, such as the Dal Khalsa in 1978 too, such as the National Council of Khalistan, reinvigorating the All India Sikh Student Federation from a leftist political group to a Sikh youth group, which had membership of hundreds of thousands by 84. So if you look at the work that Santaji Singh does during the Tarun Morcha, his work was central to bringing Sikh back to the true source of power, which is Anandpur. He wasn't interested in Delhi, never went to Delhi to negotiate or discuss or meet any Indian politicians during this whole period. He told the Sikh, but tusi pehla Anandpur aajo, take Amrit, be Shastra, and that's where the Halavola issues are going to come from. And throughout this period, Santaji Singh is setting the ground for what was going to come. Like I was saying earlier, his whole life work was the Sarbat Khalsa, in the sense of having everyone come under the Nishan Sahib, Katte ho ke sara Khalsa, come together and we can move forward. And one of the things that was integral in organizing the Sarbat Khalsa, Naren Singh Chora, who recent times remember, tried to assassinate Sukhbir Badal, he mentions that they reached out to Santaji in the early 80s and said to Santaji Singh that, why don't you speak more about Khalistan? We should push this more. And Santaji Singh said that, what would you need for like a jung in it of Khalistan? He goes, you're going to need Nojawan, and you're going to need like Tyar Pratyar Gosek in it. He goes, what do you think I'm trying to create? He goes, when I've given the order that every Sikh in every village should have motorcycles and firearms, and Singhs who are able to fire them, he goes, what do you think that's for? He goes, that's for jadon jang shuru hona, people will already be ready. And that's why the government reacted in that way, because it wasn't just Santaji Singh's. By this point, the Khalsa had been, had an emergence throughout Punjab. And Santaji Singh had also tactfully sent out certain Gursikh, like by Manbir Singh Cheheru, Baba Manachal, by Avtar Singh Brahma, many people who, some of them to not even their own knowledge, like when Manbir Singh Cheheru was sent out, he said he resisted and he disagreed with Santaji. He said that, it looks like things are kind of heating up in Amritsar. Like, why am I being sent to my pind? And Santaji sent him back to his Benchalu Shabil for the month of June. And he couldn't understand this because obviously Manbir Singh was like a major figure in the revolution, in the armed kind of uprising, one of the Hatiyarband Nojawan. But he obviously listened to Santaji and went back. And when the curfew was called and he was stuck in his pind, he was livid. Why did Santaji? He said to his mother that Santa ne mere naal dhokha kita.
Yeah.
Because he didn't understand at the point. But later on, he becomes like a core figure in the organizing for the Sarbat Khalsa. So Santaji Singh already kind of sent out these key individuals who would then kind of organize.
Just to play kind of devil's advocate, like you mentioned, Santaji was mobilizing in this way. Do you think the government were aware of the extent of that? Because if they were, why not just give in to the ASR demands? Because that would have been a masterstroke, right? Because then you're essentially giving them the subedari, saying, look, we'll agree to these. Would they ever have done that? And if they did do that, because everyone talks about the ASR, right? Like, this is like a pivotal, even today, even though despite what's happened. But can we imagine a world where the ASR was agreed upon? What would that look like?
The thing is, there's an interview with Indra, and she says this to like a journalist who said that they were very legitimate demands. They're quite simple. Why don't you agree to them? She said, because this isn't what they really want. The true power of the Sikh isn't just greater, like, economic or social rights. The root of our issues in India is that we don't have our own Raj, like we're not completely free, and we can never live under the under the oppression of the Indian state. And it's only through Khalistan that we will ever have like a hull to all these issues. So she knew from the start that like if we give in, they're not going to stop here. So that was the issue. And the other thing is, obviously you guys can talk more about this, about how the structure of India as well is more. The other issue was that the other, there's many different independence movements in India. There's many issues. It was supposed to be a federal structure. It's not supposed to be decentralized. It's not. So it would have given rise to all of those other movements as well, that like if they can have greater, because the Anandpur Resolution was for greater rights for all states, right? So that was the issue as well. So it's just the way the politics worked as well. Like a lot of the issues that we were agitating for in the Dharmik Morcha, they brought in other states. So obviously the land in Haryana, which was Punjab, the river routes which are diverted to the Rajasthan and Delhi. So it would have taken India to take back all these things against all these Hindu majority states. So it just politically would never have worked. And Sanjay actually knew this.
So with the Sarbat Khalsa in 86 emerging from this period of intense conflict, it served the purpose of what the Sarbat Khalsa was supposed to do. This is why it was so powerful, because historically the Sarbat Khalsa is the link is made between 86 Sarbat Khalsa and historic Sarbat Khalsa. It's reviving a traditional Sikh institution to make decisions. It's used during those periods of crisis, and when the normal functioning of the Panth has been disrupted. So it comes together in that crucial moment to provide that necessary leadership. And one of the resolutions of the Sarbat Khalsa in 86 was the disbanding, the immediate disbanding of the Shromani Gurdwara Committee, because the convened gathering felt that the Sarbat Khalsa, the SGPC is no longer able to carry out its functions. They can't administer the Gurdwara. It's not functioning independently. It's not providing the space for institutional development and being aligned with the state. So therefore it should be disbanded. Not that the entire concept is flawed, that how it's functioning, its current form, isn't benefiting the Panth. So it needs to be reformulated. It's a massive decision.
It's crazy because everywhere we look, there's SGPC Gurdwara.
Everywhere we looked as SGPC, there's families of Singhs that were shaheed in Darbar Sahib in 1984 that are advocates of the SGPC today. And there's no critical introspection on the SGPC. It only happens on the periphery. I mean, the SGPC has been involved in multiple scandals and issues with the Sarups of Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj, printing of Sarups of Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj, the lack of investment in infrastructure, resources, prachar, etc. Why isn't it that SGPC has embassies or branches in diaspora countries? Why isn't it that SGPC takes an active role in administrating and governing Gurdwara, not just in Punjab, but all around the world? I mean, the SGPC budget is in the hundreds of millions. It's a massive budget. So it functions as a bureaucracy.
I think it's with the fallout of the Darbar Sahib attack, like Shamsher Singh was saying, that the SGPC were found wanting, they had failed, Akali Dal had failed, they'd compromised. And then the government very quickly tried to consolidate. There was a lot of the roars, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of passion. So in order to try and control that, they enacted the Longowal Accord between Harchand Longowal, who was the former president of the Akali Dal, and Rajiv Gandhi in July 1985. And in there, it was a compromise on the Anandpur Resolution. So they're no longer even negotiating on the Anandpur Resolution, which is no longer relevant to Sikhs. So what Longowal did was considered like hugely treacherous, because he was a discredited figure already, having come out of the complex with his hands up, essentially surrendered to the army, walking over the bodies of Sikh Shardalu and Shaheeds. So the government is desperately trying now at this point to regain legitimacy and authority. So they're trying to negotiate with the Sikh. They try to use the previous political leader, Longowal, and he's assassinated a month later in August 1985, which shows, you know, the Bhavnama of the Sikh, and it's from the Naujawan at the time. At the same time, in July 1985 and September 1985, two key perpetrators of the Delhi genocide, Arjun Das and Lalat Makkanam, are assassinated. So you're having this at the same time, you're having this kind of conflict between sections of the community, one section who doesn't represent the community and one section that does. So the Sikh Naujawan are rising, and obviously they become Hartiyar Band. Again, individuals like Harjinder Singh Jinda and, you know, that group that was sent out again by Santina Singh Ji to make sure that they're like on the ground when the next phase of the struggle was going to continue. And in recognition of this, the government tries to organize an event which they call the Sarbat Khalsa. That event was in August 1984.
So three Sarbat Khalsa actually happened during this 1986 period.
Okay.
Yeah, the two of them are supported and happened with the backing of the government, and one is a revolutionary gathering. The one that we mainly remember, most people don't know that there were two other Sarbat Khalsa that happened.
Yeah, the events that were called Sarbat Khalsa, and it's quite interesting to see that the government knew where we would draw legitimacy from.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So there was obviously a lot of anger, there was a lot of passion, and how was the attack to be seen? You know, it was so they organized an event, a massive event. At this point, obviously, the Darbar Sahib, the complex is in ruins. Akal Takht Sahib is mainly demolished. So they were desperate to try and have it rebuilt, and essentially they wanted to try to like sweep this under the carpet, quickly move on, consolidate, and just try to get again. So negotiations had already started with the SGPC and the Akali Dal, who were very keen to like, you know, get back into control of the Gurdwara and like start everything and retain status quo essentially. They couldn't find anyone that would take on the project of rebuilding it under like state sponsorship. Eventually they find that Baba Santa Singh of the Burda Dal, he's agreeable, and then he is used by the government in the 11th of August 1984, so it's a few months after the attack, to organize an event which they call the Sarbat Khalsa. And in this event, they condemn the Jujarus, they condemn the Khalsa that fought against the invading Indian forces, and they instruct Baba Santa Singh to rebuild their Akal Takht.
When you say they condemn, is that the government or?
It was the gathering.
Sangat?
It was the gathering, but just to give example, Govind Tukral of the India Today writes as a witness, because as it turned out, the meet was neither Sarbat nor Khalsa. The truckloads that landed in Amritsar, many of them were non-Sikh, were interested more in wandering around the city like a bunch of tourists than in hearing speeches in the sweltering heat. When Nahang chief Santa Singh boarded the dais, the gathering had thinned to less than 10,000. That it was out and out a Congress show was obvious enough. So they essentially, what the Congress party did was bring in truckloads of Congress supporters and Congress voters from all over like India. And many of them were like not even Sikh. So they tried to do this event and try to give it legitimacy, because they knew that we would only view these like our own institutions and our own processes as legitimate, not with the government, because there's obviously a huge anti-government roar at this point. So that's how we should see that the context for the 86 Sarbat Khalsa.
And this happens under military protection and police protection from the same state that had just attacked us and engaged us in battle. Now their security forces are administrating this event, and it is different from a Sarbat Khalsa. Even though it was called a Sarbat Khalsa, is not accepted by the Panth in the history of the Panth. It's not seen as that gathering. The August gathering was a Sarbat Khalsa. It's always seen as the January 26th gathering as the Sarbat Khalsa. When people talk of the 86 Sarbat Khalsa, they're talking about that one.
Yeah.
The other one that happened was by the Akali Dal. So that was again given, though the so-called Sikh political party that's aligned with the state, they were given police and military protection in order to carry out their event. And both of these events are similar in the fact that they have the backing of the state, they have the security of the state, and they read out proclamations. And in both cases, quite similar, advocating for unity with the state, condemning the armed resistance of the Panth, and pushing us kind of more into this reconciliatory mode. Whereas the 86 Sarbat Khalsa happens organically. Before that gathering happens, Jatha Pindra write an article that's in a book called Panthak Dastavej, and it's called Sarbat Khalsa di Lor Kyun. And that article is distributed to the all 12,000 bins in Punjab. They go hand to hand, every single Jathebandi. They outline that there's serious institutional failings, that the way the SGPC is functioning is similar to how it was functioning pre-1984, that we're not going to be able to resolve the Panthic issues through the state-aligned factions. We need to gather now and cement the Qurbaniya that the Panth has given and give this new direction forward. So that will happen much more organically, again, without the police backing, without government security, in open defiance, in open defiance of the state. There was still Jajaru Jathebandiya. And then when we come to actually look at what the Sarbat Khalsa passed as its resolution, it formulates a Panj-member Panthic committee as well as other functions. But just jumping ahead here, that Panj-member Panthic committee, 4 of them are then killed by the Indian state. And we also see Jathedar Gurdev Singh Konke, the Jathedar of Akal Takht, killed by the Indian state. We see before that, we see Baba Gurbachan Singh Ji Manuchal, who's the Jathedar of Akal Takht, killed by the Indian state. So we see the machinery of the Indian state that's propping up these 2 other events is still violently against any Sikh that is resisting. So it's not about it's not a flat criticism of the SGPC or any individual, any Jathebandi. It's for us to understand how power functions, because that's the whole point behind the Akal Takht and the Sarbat Khalsa, is to put the authority within the collective Khalsa so that we can make, Panth da Sanja Labh, like decisions that are in benefit of the Panth going forward. So when we look at the January 86 Sarbat Khalsa, one of the mate that come out of it, the Panthic committee that comes out of it, then go on to do the declaration of Khalistan in April for Vaisakhi 86, which is obviously, again, a massive step. And 26 January is India Independence Day. I think it's like 24th, 26th, is in those days that India celebrates its independence. So they're holding Sarbat Khalsa on the date that India is celebrating its independence to declare that, no, we honor our shaheeds, we don't recognize your institutions, we see no authority vested in the state, and we're moving forward in the decision of our Jujarus. Satwan Singh, Beyant Singh, when they're hanged, they're going to become the first shaheeds of Khalistan. That's like the mate that they pass from Akal Takht side.
Yeah, when they just come back to the 2 other gatherings that are called Sarbat Khalsa, just to flip it again, it showcases how threatened the state felt. Despite the fact that they've demolished the Akal Takht, they've taken out Sikh leadership, they're still trying to co-opt Sikh decision-making institutions. And so that, again, that's a testament to the power of Sarbat Khalsa. So they even, like they say about the British, or the British knew how important Raj was. Like in one of his letters, Lord Dalhousie states that the British intent in Punjab was the utter destruction of Sikh power. So in the same way, the Indian state and those individuals in power, they know and understand how important the Sikhs are in Punjab in terms of, and also how much of an affinity they have with pursuing Raj, to the point where they're now propping up these, how we even call whatever term to use, but these gatherings to mimic what Sarbat Khalsa was. But the Sangat sees through that. And you could argue that also then drives them, because the way in which the Panth gets together, what are the numbers for January 9th?
They're like over 500,000.
Over half, they say, right? Yeah. At the initial. So that was January 26th. And then obviously they come together for the official Alan on the 29th of April. But I think that all gets this roast within the Panth.
And you see the photos that exist of the Sarbat Khalsa in January 1986. Just look at the photos of the other Sarbat Khalsa. The ones in January 96 is a sea of Kesari Dastar, Sangat overflowing all over the Parakrama. It happens in defiance of the SGPC and the Akali Dal in Darbar Sahib, within the Darbar Sahib complex. And they bring to the center, January 1986 Sarbat Khalsa wasn't perfect. It wasn't like this is perfection. This is, ideologically we're describing the absolute flawless execution. This is happening in conditions of war. This is happening where there's a Panthic consciousness emerging, a rebellion building that's seen a massive level of violence from the state. This is happening in after decades of subjugation. So again, like when Darbar Sahib attack happens, the entire population of Punjab isn't in Darbar Sahib fighting the Indian state. When November happens, even at that point, Sikhs are getting killed defenselessly. They're getting killed without arms. So clearly, there's different sections of the Sikh community understanding different things. This is not like one blanket force, right? Like the entirety of the Panth is now awake and everyone's picked up arms and there's open rebellion against the Indian state. There were Jathebandiyan. And it's been like that within our Ityas as well. During the Vadda Kallukara, Shota Kallukara, not all Sikhs were Hathiarband and Jatheband. Some were living in Lahore, some were living in the cities and they got slaughtered. And if you look at like Baba Tara Singh Wan, like with the period that their Sakhi emerges, the space that they created was a shelter for the Sikhs that were Jujaru, that came together and wanted to prepare after the decimation, Banda Singh Bahadur and like the violence of the Mughals. This was this period of training and rebuilding. So Darbar Sahib Jung in January is similar to that, even though it's like it completely dominates Sikh memory today because it's such a pivotal event. It's a massive turning point in our Ityas. So through that kind of really a chaotic period, those that were on the outside or the periphery of it still look at Darbar Sahib as a tragedy. They don't understand the full reality of it. Those that did understand the reality of it, of this is reawakening our Panthic collective Hond Hasti, the right of the Khalsa to exist and be in this world as the sovereign Khalsa, they then were able to come together in this way and put that authority back into the Panth in collective decision making, joint leadership, ke Panth di sanji agwai. Because there's different factions, different groups, even in Darbar Sahib, right? It wasn't all Damdami Taksal. There's different Jathebandiyan that were fighting from the Kankini Jata, the Akal Federation, different Kar Seva Jathebandiyan. Everyone was united. There were things that had been in the Dal for their whole life that had left the Dal, like by Avtar Singh Brahma, who come and joined one of the fighting Jathebandiyan. And it brings together everybody in this way that understands ki nishanna kiya. Like Sant Janel Singh said, gather under the Nishan Sahib and fight for this one nishanna of your Raj. So in that sense, the Sarbat Khalsa in January is very, very different in its makeup and its purpose and how it's remembered by the Panth.
Not just the Panth, but you will never find reference in non-Sikh or anti-Sikh accounts of these other events because they were farcical, they were shams, and they held no legitimacy. So the government themselves, when they talk about this period of history, they never refer to them.
It was 10,000 versus 500,000.
Yeah,
right?
10,000, and it's like 10,000 Congress. They were like Congress party members and many like non-Sikhs.
And you mentioned with the one in January that was organized, or the message was sent out by Jatha Pindra.
Jatha Pindra, yeah.
But was it just Jatha Pindra in terms of, was it just one Jatha leading this, or was it the whole Panth?
I don't think Pindra only Jatha had 500,000 Sikhs in membership.
And also, like Sheikh Singh was saying about like that it's a Jathapandi that calls it, right?
It's a Jathapandi.
So they convened it, but it was a meeting of the whole Sarbat Khalsa. And in regards to some of the criticisms of it not being perfect, we've got to remember as well that many of the Panthic the Panthic committee things, many of them, that they were all wanted. They were all wanted people. They came in disguises, had to leave in disguises. This wasn't a perfect situation. And still to gather that many people in against what was we were essentially under military rule at this point in Punjab, military occupation, I should say, was an amazing event. And another way to look at it is, where would we be today if the Sarbat Khalsa 1986 hadn't happened in January? So the government would have come through, the Longwal Accord would have settled the Sikh issues, the Sikh question in Punjab. Under Baba Santa Singh, the Akal Takht would have been rebuilt using the government's funds. Essentially what they were trying to do is very, very quickly remove all knowledge, all history, all recognition of the Sikh Sangharsh before that, from 1978 up until 1984. And we would have very, very quickly gone back into the pre-1978 period, which was a terrible period.
Which where we are now.
Which is essentially where we are now. And that's the period that we would have got to. Instead, what the Sarbat Khalsa, as it was called, under the Sharan of Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj, and with those Guru Sikhs all together, because of that, it's a decision that will be until the Sarbat Khalsa gets together and decides differently, it's going to be eternal. It stands today, and hundreds of thousands of Gur Sikhs have fought and given their lives to that resolution, right?
And that's another key point as well, and a key difference between understanding the effectiveness of the January Sarbat Khalsa called by the Panth. That launches a decade armed struggle. All of these Jujaru Jathebandi are now reformulate, and they understand and they commit that our Gurtam and our Shastar are unikar, that we cannot separate our Gurdwara and our Shastar. Miri Piri cannot be separated, has to exist together in this world. We're committed to this struggle, and they go out and they fight for 10 years without the cover of jungles, without the cover of mountains, against one of the most modernized states, forces in the world, against a completely different way of fighting that the state has, which is, if you're fighting against me, I'm gonna go murder your whole family. So they weren't fighting on the same principles as the state. So they're operating in an intense period of violence. So that shows the effectiveness of the Sarbat Khalsa, the power of that 500,000 Sangat, because not everybody fought against the Indian state, but so many families gave sharan and shelter to the Jujarus that were fighting, so much so that the Indian state had to come up with counterinsurgent policies in order to destabilize the Punjab's support base, which was getting people like Akali Fulla Singh, was it Fulla Nihang,
Fulla,
who would dress up in Bana, shout pro-movement slogans and go and commit atrocities. That what they called black cats, basically. And even that, they've tried to rehabilitate the image of the cat. There's a Netflix documentary, I think we've spoken about it in a previous show, where it's such a high budget production to rehabilitate that the cat is the victim here, and the baddie is the Jujaru. And you find that amongst Sikhs that you'll talk about, that they look at the movement with distrust, and that's changed hugely, and especially in those alake within Punjab where the movement had strength. Everybody supports this Sangharsh. Funnily enough, I was watching on Instagram, random videos came up of this guy from a Hindu family driving around in villages, asking about shaheeds from Charasi, and going to their houses and going to the schools and going to the places where these individuals were shaheed. And it's the most profound content I've ever seen in my life. He's driving in Punjab today, and you see he asks a young person, and they don't really know who he's talking about. Soon as he gets near any Bazurg and be like, Shaheed Gurjeet Singh da ghar kitte hai, and they're like, it's over there, that's the school he went to. That, and there's that love and that memory that still exists. So the state wasn't fully able to destroy the imagery of the Sangharsh and the Kirdar of the Khalsa. That's what they attacked, right? When you have black cats, you want to attack the moral legitimacy of the Sangharsh. You want to say, no, these people are criminals. And even after Darbar Sahib, they tried to attack the Sikhi of Sant Jarnail Singh. They were like, oh, we found gold and his character was bad, because that's where Sikhs derived their authority from. But it shows how effective and how powerful the January 1986 Sarbat Khalsa was, that the state then has to go on a huge campaign of slaughter, disinformation, and fear mongering that lasts until this day. Still till this day. I mean, when we did the reaction video with KPS Kill's brother, you can see that he's like, oh, these guys were villains and they were very bad guys and blah blah blah. That state propaganda still has a massive grip over these people.
But the impact of the Sarbat Khalsa in 1986 was to chart the Panth on a trajectory towards Khalistan, and and the Qawm will continue to kind of to struggle towards that objective. The Lannama in April that the Panth Committee announced formally declares Khalistan. That was in April, and I believe it's within a few months of that, General Vedya is assassinated.
So we spoke about all the elements of the 86 Sarbat Khalsa, the fake ones that happened beforehand, and what would be nice to hear for the Sangha now is what actually happened in January 86.
So just before January 86, there's a lot of groundwork that's carried out. So a lot of the Sikh activists, the Naujawan who were wanted at this point, and by Manpreet Singh Chehru is given a lot of credit for this, they then go bend and start to reorganize who still remains, who kind of escaped the dragnet of the military forces. They start to organize, and we must give a lot of credit to Baba Takar Singh Ji as well, someone who had spent obviously a lot of time with Sant Janel Singh Ji, who knew and understood the vision, and he gives very, very important leadership at this point. And it's under his name essentially that the Sarbat Khalsa is eventually called. But before it is called, there is intense meetings, gatherings. There was a Shahidi Smagam you mentioned as well. So a lot of where under Baba Takar Singh they gave Sanman to the Shaheeds of June 1984. So a lot of mobilization is happening, a lot of organizing is taking place, and they are gathering the Naujawan and the Panthic activists that are still on the ground, moving towards the goal, which is the Sarbat Khalsa.
We jump quite a lot, right? Like from like the 18th century, like to what Sarbat Khalsa is conceptually, to what happens in 1986. So that, as we talked about, emerges through this period of conflict with the state. So following the Darbar Sahib invasion in November 1984, Kallukara, the Jathebandiya that are surviving this, like Jatha, Pindra, the Akhand Kitni Jatha, Akal Federation, Sikh Students Federation, they want to reformulate and gather at Akal Takht Sahib. Initially, they look to the Akali Dal and the SGPC. Hopefully within those groups, there would be some leadership and guidance given. And not only is it not given, as we talked about, it goes in the complete other way. They compromise with the state immediately. Out of that, you see the assassination of Longowal, which I feel like, we touch upon, but such a significant event. Somebody from the Sikhs who's in this position of Sikh political leadership is assassinated by the Sikhs themselves for wanting to compromise with the state and essentially make the same deal, but on much worse terms than the Sahibzade they were offered. He does a really shallow version of that. And at least the Sahibzade were being honored as princes and given Sanman and given anything they wanted. This geezer is legitimizing Gandhi. Gandhi gets more out of it than Longowal does. So a really low level compromise. And as a result, he's assassinated. And then the Jatha Pindra primarily in this time takes that role of leadership because Jatha Pindra, Mukhi had been instrumental in this whole period. And then they write that article, Sarbat Khalsa Di Lorkiyo, and in there they make an appeal to the consciousness of the Sikh. They remind them of where authority comes from, which is Sri Akal Takht Sahib. They remind them of the Qurbaniya that the Sikhs have given and what the purpose of those Qurbaniya is, and remind them again that Sama Onaya, that Qurbaniya are going to be demanded from the Panth again. And they say that because of the failure of these institutions to take the Panth forward and give us guidance, we need to revive our historic traditions and come together and reinvest the authority within the Panth and have a Sarbat Khalsa, that we need to bring this institution back in order to solidify everything that's happened, this intense period that we've come through. And obviously the role that Sant Janel Singh plays in terms of their sacrifice and the sacrifices of all of those that gave Shahadat in Darbar Sahib is a collective Panthic sacrifice. It is for all of us. Qawmi Shaheeds again, and why they gave their Shahadat and what meaning it holds for all of us, and looking at it as a turning point, looking at it as we got to give ourselves some direction from this point forward. And then that leaflet is distributed. And at the same time, the government is trying to organize their own events and pass their own resolutions. And at the same time, Akal Takht and Darbar Sahib is still under military occupation. They do other so-called operations, Black Thunder 1, Black Thunder 2, where they take over Darbar Sahib. They arrest people. Still, people are getting killed in the streets. Obviously, November's happening. They're going into villages and killing people. So all of this stuff's happening within that time period. So for then that Sadda to be given, the call to be taken, and then a Sarbat Khalsa to happen in Darbar Sahib, where different Jajaru Jathebandiya and leadership of different Jajaru Jathebandiya come together and put in the authority into the Akal Takht and say, look, the SGPC is not functioning. The Akali Dal, etc. is not functioning. We need to be united. The authority for everything has to come from Akal Takat and from the collective Panth, not from an external body that's, like the state, or those that are compromising with the state, like the SGPC, that's not functioning in the way it should be. The authority has to come from the Panth. It has to come from our Jujaru Jathebandiya. It has to come from our Shaheeds. So everything that happens in
and more than that, they just weren't functioning. They were disbanded.
Completely disbanded. And so everything that essentially happens in June 1984, the Sarbat Khalsa solidifies in the form of Gurmata and resolution in order to preserve it for the future of the Panth. And so even though there may be, Panthically, there may be like differences and like people here that don't really understand what's going on, they ask questions like, oh, who's the Panth? And, a group of people can't decide on behalf of the Panth. Whereas if you actually look at Panthic historians and even the state for that matter, like the state isn't the Panth, but the state understands that these factions that are aligned with the anti-state movement, this is how they're moving forward.
Yeah.
And so the Panths, they ask, like I think Panthic Dastavej is a really great collection of articles that everything that I'm mentioning, by the way, like they're all in this book that's been compiled to look at like a period of about 50 years of like Panthic history, all the Matte resolutions, everything. There's a 3-hour video of the Sarbat Khalsa. So even though within Panthic Jathebandiya there may be like differences of tactics and strategy.
And just to be open, one of the criticisms of the Sarbat Khalsa was that the Babbar Khalsa weren't involved in the Panthic committee, like none of their fighters or their leadership was included in the Panthic committee. But one thing we have to remember is that none of the resolutions that were passed by the Sarbat Khalsa were those that were not in agreement with Babbar Khalsa. So the Babbar Khalsa had set up as a freedom fighting organization in 1981. So they were already like way ahead of like this thing. The important thing about the Gurmata is that it solidifies, it formalizes it.
The direction
Exactly.
that everyone's moving.
Yeah. So some people might already be moving on towards this direction already, but it's just to formalize it. And I think what's really important is to remember that we have these beliefs and these opinions about Sant Jaya Singh Ji and the Jujaru Singhs and how the Sangharsh was fought and what happened, and we have a way of viewing it. And a lot of the reasons why we have this vision of it is because of the Sarbat Khalsa, because they were able to formalize it. So, for example, when the Rabasa attack happens, what's being broadcasted around the world? Terrorism, hot seat of terrorism, flushed out separatists, all this kind of like bakwas essentially. So that's why the Sarbat Khalsa was so important. And the other thing is that before the Sarbat Khalsa, there had already been a few kind of armed actions by Sikh Nojawan. Essentially Arjan Das and Azam Makkan. So it was very important for the Khalsa to bring everything under like an umbrella, under some sort of guidance, some sort of coordination, so that everyone is working together for the same goals. So it was super important.
And what were the resolutions then that were passed?
So the resolutions that were passed on the 26th of Jan in 1986, so there was a formation of the Panthic Committee, which the things I've already spoken about. And their kind of main purpose was to act as the decision-making, the coordinating body, as we were kind of going towards April 29th as well. But they were a temporary mechanism for the Panth's decision-making at this point. There was also the rejection of the SGPC. So the SGPC was disbanded, which is really interesting because if you look at what the SGPC is today, it's still very much active. It still governs Gurdwara. Yeah. But at that time, the Panth decided that the SGPC was no longer fit to serve that role because they recognize. Because on the one hand, when we do officially get the declaration for Khalistan in April, that essentially is a declaration of war with the state. So therefore, the Panth can't have any state-operated bodies governing its institutions, and the SGPC was created it goes back to the 1920s when the British bring it into play. So it shows you that the foresight of the Gursikhs who are part of this whole kind of mechanism as well. So the SGPC is disbanded. There's a general call for Panthic unity within this Sarbat Khalsa as well, and then there's a lot of grounding done towards that main Mukh Nishan of Khalistan. So, for example, it's where they also reaffirm that by Satwant Singh and Ghair Singh, if they are to be hung, because by this point they're still in jail, right? The decision is made that if they are hung, they will become the first shaheeds of the Khalistan movement. So there's a lot of kind of like foresight within the decisions that are taken and the resolutions that are made. So that's essentially the January resolutions.
When you're speaking about decision making here, who are the ones? Are there any key figures, names? Sakhi Singh we spoke about earlier. Anything here that stands out?
Yeah, this is for me where like the Sarbat Khalsa of '86 really aligns well with the precedent we have in Jathas. So like Shamsher Singh mentioned earlier, that the actual tradition of the Sarbat Khalsa would be that you'd have the Sakhi Singh would come and lead essentially this kind of whole meeting. And the Sakhi Singh in this instance was by Jarnail Singh, who most of us will be familiar with in terms of the nitnim that they do, the seva they do with that. So they were the Sakhi Singh. So I guess once they've made these announcements, they would have then taken a back seat, and then the Panthic, was the Panthic committee then at that point brought in and they were leading it?
No, they were announced the formation of a Panthic committee. Other names were given at that Sarbat Khalsa in January 26.
Yeah. So a lot of it, we were speaking earlier about how like it wasn't necessarily, done as it would have been done in ideal circumstances.
Yeah.
Because you're still, the government is still coming down, they're still cracking down on Sikhs mobilizing. So despite all of that, the fact that they come together in the hundreds of thousands, there's images of that particular Sarbat Khalsa where like Sikh Sangat are sitting on Darshan Diori, anything around the Parkarma, anything that was where there was a bit of space, there was Sangat that were there together. So it was phenomenal that actually happened in the time frame that it did.
It shows you the effectiveness of the Sarbat Khalsa, that even though it was called in times of emergency essentially and in under like huge constraints, but still the decisions and resolutions that were passed, they formed the grounding, the foundation essentially for the Khalistan Sangharsh.
Yeah, and then the resolutions around Khalistan were the support of the right of every Sikh to be armed, and that we're never going to fall into this trap again of relying on the state.
And that was specifically because the event called by the government in August '84, they condemned the Khalsa for having weapons, and they said that there shouldn't be weapons in the...
So they explicitly supported that. And then obviously the reconstruction of the Akal Takat Sahib, which is, some view it with controversy today, which is the Akal Takat after the attack. Firstly, the government lied and they did massive propaganda saying the Akal Takat is intact, which shows us that their plan was to, cordon off the area and rebuild it in secret so that, that they could... claim that it wasn't damaged. But obviously we know that was the case. The damage to the structure was intensive, and then it was quickly rebuilt, and it was contracted out, and it was rebuilt like in a really really fast, like in a really shortened timeline, right? Like they brought in engineers and they worked out throughout the night and like contractors. So the Sarbat Khalsa passes the resolution that the Akal Takat, the reconstructed Akal Takat, is to be demolished and is to be rebuilt by the Sangat themselves using the Sangats, the Swand only. That we're not going to use any external contractors.
How long was that Akal Takat Sahib standing for? Do we know roughly?
A year maybe?
Well, '86, so they started demolishing it on the day.
They started demolishing on the day, yeah. But like no, the rebuilt one that was standing for about a year.
Yeah.
It wasn't even just like the Sangats, like a bit like
their
contributions, the labor. But also, I remember, I'm pretty sure there was a podcast that BOS TV did recently with Gyani Jivpal Singh, where they were speaking about even the marble that was used and the design and the intricacy of the design and the marble. There was that was kind of ignored because of this rush just to build it. So this brought in any old marble from somewhere. So the actual the maryada that went into it, or the thought process in terms of its Sikh cosmology and stuff, that was completely disregarded as well. So there's other reasons beyond.
That was part of the Mate as well, that they want to realign it traditional maryada of how we build our Astan and maintain our Astan. So looking at the Sarbat Khalsa, how it happened and the resolutions that it passed, the environment that it happens in, where you have the state restricting all of the space, the changes that they bring in institutionally, that the Akali Dal, the SGPC, other Takat Jathedar that we're going to replace, that is going to be in the hands of those whose loyalty is with the Khalsa, appointing a Panthic committee, Panj member Panthic committee of Jujarus that were fighting and associated with the armed struggle Jathebandiyan to then take the Panth forward in the next phase, taking the authority away from like SGPC Akali Dal, and honouring the shaheeds of Darbar Sahib itself, you know, General Sabeg Singh, Sant Janel Singh, all of the shaheeds that took place, naming those that are the traitors of the Panth, like the Rajiv Longowal, anyone who's cooperating with the government, and then taking a very, very clear position on the armed struggle, completely differentiates the 86 Sarbat Khalsa from the other two that were taking place, because they were basically saying the things that were opposite, and everyone can, you know, really encourage everyone to go out there and read you know, the resolutions from those time periods, so you can see the difference for yourself. And you know, obviously we're summarizing you know, these documents and these positions, but it just shows you how the January 26th Sarbat Khalsa, how it was aligned to our Panth Maryada and the sovereign Hond Hasti of the Panth versus you know, the state.
And then what happens in April? What's so key about the day of April 29th?
So April 29th is the Khalistan Alan Nama Divas. So
What does that mean?
that's like 40 years. So Alan Nama is like the declaration. So today is 40 years. Well, this April, Vaisakhi, is 40 years since the
Official
say 40 years.
Yeah, 40 years.
So yeah,
It's the official declaration.
so this Vaisakhi, and again, like, you know, happens according to our traditional festivals, our traditional celebrations, shall I say, marks 40 years since the Alan Nama of Khalistan, which the Panthic committee appointed in January made the declaration in Vaisakhi 1986, 29th of April, as this is our day. And like something that Jaswant Singh Kala talks about in his writings as well, how every Sikh all over the world should celebrate 29th April as like Khalsa Day. And the fact that they did it at Vaisakhi, again, you know, a dihar that's associated with our sovereignty, the formation of the Khalsa, and we look at today where Vaisakhi's largely become a quote-unquote religious gathering, and the politics there are the politics of the state where, you know, the MPs are given time on stage. Very few Nagar Kirtans over the in the world actually centralize the Sangharsh and the shaheeds of the Sangharsh. You know, there's standout examples from like Australia, Canada, few Nagar Kirtans here, where, and it's becoming more and more here as well, to be fair. You know, I actually know, what am I talking about, man? Every single Nagar Kirtan, there's like, you know, pictures of the shaheeds and stuff, even though the committee may or may not agree, but you see it everywhere. Yeah.
And then you know, like after the 29th of April, do you see the response from the state? So like Shamsher Singhari mentioned, Black Operation Black Thunder 1, Black Thunder 2. I believe number 1 happens in 86 and Black Thunder Operation 2 happens in 88. So the crackdown from the state, because they've understood, perhaps even more so than maybe Sikhs today, what 29th of April represents to them. It's a huge threat to their existence, because this is now the Sikhs overtly, unapologetically claiming war on the state and saying that nothing else will suffice, nothing else will be enough other than out and out while striking sovereignty. So that also comes up as well. And then we see it over the next decade or so, right? Of on the one hand, you've got the Jujarus who are trying to deliver on the mandate of the Sarbat Khalsa and the Gurmata that was passed, and then the response from the state is violations of human rights, you know, mass killings, invading Darbar Sahib twice more, and then it continues on that trajectory until around that mid 1990s.
So you mentioned the Panthic committee, and there's 5 individuals. So what happened to these 5 individuals? You mentioned earlier about some of them becoming shaheed.
Yeah, I think earlier, like I said, 4 were shaheed, but actually it was 3 that were shaheed. So they were Gyani Arur Singh, Baba Gurbachan Singh Ji Manuchal, Gurdev Singh Usmanwala, Vasant Singh Zafarwal, and Paitanna Singh. So yeah, out of those 5, out of Gyani Arur Singh, Baba Gurbachan Singh Manuchal, and Gurdev Singh Usmanwala, those 3 became shaheed, and the other 2 Singhs are still alive.
And might also be beneficial for those listening and watching for us to maybe make reference to what was actually written and said by the Panthic committee at the Sarbat Khalsa. So one of the things they say here, they say, Sarbat Khalsa ji da ਇਹ ਸਮਾਗਮ ਸਪਸ਼ਟ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਸਿੱਖ ਭਾਰਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੁਲਾਮ ਹਨ ਅਤੇ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਮੁੱਢਲਾ ਅਧਿਕਾਰ ਹੈ. So essentially what they're saying is that the Sarbat Khalsa recognizes that very clearly that within Bharat, within India, that the Sikhs are enslaved. And this is something which Sant Janel Singh Ji, war or ohi gal karde si. They're constantly trying to remind the Sikhs of this condition of slavery, that they're living in as second-class citizens within the Indian state, and that the Sikhs are going to challenge that through struggle, through standing up and fighting, and keeping that going. So these are the type of messages that are coming out from the Panth committee at the Sarbat Khalsa. So it's very clear where they're taking the Sikhs and where they're taking the Panth.
And that's echoed in the Alarnama that happens in April, where they say the call is that this Khalistan is a fulfillment of the demand of the Sangat. That the Sangat, through their Qurbaniya, through their Ardas for Raj Karega Khalsa, this leads us, and the fact that Sant Janel Singh said that the foundation would be laid of Khalistan, in June 1984, that this is a fulfillment of that. So they say, our translation is, on this auspicious day from Sri Akal Takht Sahib, an announcement is made before the entire world and all governments that from this day onwards, the Khalsa Panth shall have its own homeland called Khalistan, where the authority, nishan, institutions and sovereignty of the Sikhs shall remain permanently established. And in there, the call to the Sikh community is get to see Jathe Bandh Hovo, and you give a furman from Gurbani, Maran Mansa Surya Hak Hai Je Hoye Maran Parvano. And that is the call. This is the call sounded today by the 5-member Panth committee, urging readiness for sacrifice and effort that's going to be required ahead. And then they talk about what the guiding principles is, because we don't have enmity or dushmani with anybody. We don't look at anyone as begana. We look at everyone as ours, but we're fighting for our existence in this dunya. And they even say that they hope the government of India will stop being influenced by anti-Sikh politics and recognize the reality of Khalistan. That's
so they weren't interested in creating any upheaval or shedding undue blood, and we expect the same from others to express our firm faith in resolving all the issues cordially and through dialogue with the Hindu majority and government of India. So it was a declaration of Khalistan, but they were also well aware that given the nature of the state that Shastra Chakne Pene, Jang Lani Pene, but there was that initial call to the Indian state that we'll accept your surrender now, essentially.
And you've spoke about now from 86 to 95, and we covered a whole podcast on that as well, what happened, and all the Jujaru Singhs and so on. What happened afterwards then? Like you've mentioned from 1995 to present day, respectfully, it's gone a different direction, or it's come down. We've kind of
stagnated.
Yeah. So how has that happened? How have we gone from what happened in 95 afterwards that caused this big shift?
So from this point forward, from 86, the Sarbat Khalsa, the Khalistan Alarnama, very clearly, even though the spirit of the document of the Alarnama, the spirit of the Gurmata, it was about internal reorganization and what our relationships are going to be like externally within the state. That we're not interested in conflict, but we will defend ourselves, and we're not going to lose faith in our Shastra. That was the reminder to the Sangha that you can't, ek gurpeer hai hamare, that we can't exist in the world separate from our Shastra. That they're part of maintaining the pavitrata and the patshahi of our institutions. The sanctity, the sacredness and the sovereignty of our institutions are always maintained through our Shastra. And so from that point forward, the state ramps up its aggression. So what they call, the code name the Indian state gave was Operation Woodrose, where they would go into villages and they would commit brutality, sexual violence against the civilian population of Punjab. They brought in counter-insurgency policies. They were trained by other governments that they were friendly with of how to fight an insurgent movement. It's very difficult for governments to fight against guerrilla movements because the people support them. So they, brought in policies to undermine that. And we talk about this in other podcasts, but
legislation was enacted.
The legislation is enacted, and just unchecked brutality from the state. And in that, the Jujarus are fighting, and they continue fighting for 10 years. those that are awake to those conditions realize that we're not going to be able to move forward, and we're not going to be able to survive if we don't fight. And they fought through multiple different formations, and the movement comes to a halt because it's out-violenced by the Indian state, and there's internal fracturing here because there's a decade of pressure from the government, and they're not only are they trying to respond to Sikh insurgency through genocide, they're also compromising anything they can compromise, from individuals to spaces, maintaining control of our Astan, enacting laws, very publicly killing, publicly and indiscriminately killing Sikh Najwan. So creating a regime of terror within Punjab. So that's the environment through which Sikh Jujarus fight for 10 years. I mean, we should really do a whole podcast. Like, it's really unfair to try to summarize it, like 10 years, insurgency.
I think
it is so much that today Sikhs themselves don't talk about the insurgency in clear-cut terms with clear languages. There's a hesitancy, and we exist in an era of, social media censorship. Censorship within our Gurdwara, within even Sikh spaces occurs to an extent as well. But social media is massive. You start naming Jathabandiyan, you start talking about individuals, they'll shut down entire channels. I mean, they shut down, the YouTube shut down Shromani Gurdwara Committee's YouTube channel because they did a Shahidi Smagam broadcast. Like, that's the level of censorship that we're facing. And this all happens, through demands that the Indian government makes. Channel restrictions take place. So we're still dealing with the space that we need. And then, so that's the government's actions. And then Sikh advocacy doesn't make space for Jujaru Sangharsh. What it makes space for is human rights violations and victim narratives, which then further restricts the space that we need to even have conversations like this in the first place, where we want to look at our Ityas, and we want to look at crucial periods of how the Khalsa is fighting, how it's reorganizing itself, how is it facing the challenges, what are those challenges, how the government's responding, so that we can at least have a critical understanding of our Ityas. So yeah, that's the 10-year period is really difficult to summarize, and then continuing to there's
and the thing is, what we've been doing in the diaspora hasn't changed from the 80s, and it's an indictment of how ineffective these other methods are. That during the Sangharsh, they had huge successes, and essentially, as is throughout Sikh history, it's a very small minority of people that actually affect the change. From the Panthic Committee, the Panth Singh, out of there's 3 organizations that come out: the Khalistan Commando Force, the Bindrai Tiger Force, and the Khalistan Liberation Force. So those 3 things were the mukhis of those. So General Hari Singh, aka by Manbir Singh Cheheru, he leads the Khalistan Commando Force. Baba Manachal obviously leads the Bindrai Tiger Force. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that it's a very small group of people that are representing the whole Qawm. Have got the tapia of the Qawm, have got the blessings of the Qawm. But it's a very small group of people that lead, that begin this revolution, this armed Sangharsh against India in April 1986, formally. And from that period, they wage a war against India. And then as they holy, every Singh, Singhniya give Shahidi in the battlefield, and that has now come to a halt or a pause, what we're left is the same kind of Ghulam politics that weren't working then. And those people were doing those same politics while these guys were fighting in the field. They have had no successes, and we will continue to have no successes outside of that field. But we have that belief that that's it will always bring color, and
Do you think it's a little bit different because I know this terminology is mentioned a few times about annihilate and then assimilate? Do you think now, compared to in the past where it was just clear, your enemy is annihilate, now they've put another layer to it where they've tried to assimilate us, and that's what's made it more difficult for us to adjust? Or
it's a continuation of the British policies, because you see that from that day, in Jallianwala Bagh, in Guru Ka Bagh Morcha, there's those that are serving the state firing against the Sangha. Jallianwala Bagh, even in this period in the Punjab insurgency, KPS Gill was from a Sikh background, was from a Sikh family. Punjab police officers that were carrying out violence against Amritari, Gursikh, Singh, Singhniya, Bibiyan, Bacche were from Sikh families. And some of them that had a consciousness then came out and told their account, so we know what happened during the Shahadat of Pai Anok Singh or Jaswant Singh Khalra. Otherwise we wouldn't know, because they didn't have that attack of consciousness in it. So yeah, I think it is it's always been the approach, like if they can't assimilate you, they will annihilate you. And that's the lesson I think unfortunately many within the Sikh Panth have learned, is that if you don't assimilate, you are going to get annihilated. But I think the memory of the Panth honors the Sangharsh, and it will continue to honor the Sangharsh despite all of these hardships.
Yeah, but that that, just to go back to your question, that is a key difference between this Sangharsh and any Sangharsh we've had in the past, especially the 18th century going back, is that even with like Abdali invades Punjab like 8 times, but he comes, he loots, he plunders, he attacks, then he always returns back to like Afghanistan. He doesn't have this like greater will to change the individual, whereas like in the Indian state, this idea of Indian nationalism under the constant like justification of national security, or even before them the British, they are looking to change the individual, not just they're not just attacking for the sake of attacking in a war situation. That's the key difference. So since 1995, that's something I think we're still trying to maybe come to terms with. That it wasn't just like the physical, like you were saying, annihilation. There was already assimilation that had begun 150 years before that. So that's definitely a key factor. But for me, like often there's parallels drawn between this Sangharsh and previous Sangharsh that happened. But there's also examples like in the 18th century where the Sikhs, where the Sangharsh slowed down, like after Banda Singh Bahadur, most of the Panth, the fighting force, had been annihilated, and therefore others then retreated into the jungles just to survive. But what they never forgot, what they never kind of lost sight of, was that the importance of striving to establish Raj, which is why then like under the guidance even of Mata Sundari ji and Mata Sahib Kaur, holy like by Mani Singh's guidance, they start to assemble at the Akal Takht twice a year. And from those biannual gatherings, a new generation of Sikh leadership emerges with Nawab Kapoor Singh, Justice Singh Ranguria, Ahluwalia, all of those. They all emerge from Sikh spaces and in that Sandki group. And perhaps that's something that maybe needs to be, maybe this is what you mentioned earlier about Punjab, guys in Punjab looking to rejuvenate those institutions. Because when we have that space where we're coming together, maybe not in an official Gurmata sense, but just coming together as Gursikhs in the Hazuri of Guru Sahib, is from those spaces where that new kind of Sangharsh or the continuation of that will happen. And there was in 2015 a reaffirmation in many ways of the 86th Sarbat Khalsa, right? Maybe you can speak to that.
The vision of the Khalistan Alan-Nama isn't just about Sikhs fighting and asserting their Padshahi. It's about what we're fighting for. So it talks about the type of social structure that we envision, opening with the Mukwag Jablag Khalsa Rehe Niara Tablag Tej Diu Masara. And it says that the Khalistan Sarkar, the Khalsa, will not tolerate monopolies on education or monopolies over capital. We don't want education to be used to spread propaganda, to keep people in social backwardsness, like the caste system is what they explicitly talk about. That there should be an equal society where everyone should be given opportunity, that we should respect Qudrat, that education should be used to uplift people. So they're articulating a vision that says, the seva is fruitful if the hands and feet are used to serve samaj in it, then fir uthaye pendi hai. And that's the vision that they're outlining. And obviously they talk about the role of the state. They talk about our atiyas, like where we draw inspiration from, but they're outlining a vision of how we're going to move forward. Like what type of society are we fighting for? What is the vision for Khalistan? And I think some people, that say that, there wasn't a vision, or like, what's our constitution? And, in those crucial moments, Sikhs have tried to articulate. And for me, my position has always been, like whatever these people did, these Gursikhs did, they did their best in like brutal conditions. Yeah. And like I was saying, like after, you say what happens after 95, after that, the Rail Gaddi, which is the Jujaru leadership, is essentially decimated. Dabbe appe khar jande hai. Like all the carriages just stop, innit? Because that Jujaru leadership is not giving agwai, it's not driving the Panth forward into understanding the question of power. And that's what, Ranveer Singh was talking about earlier, like what happens with the state and colonization, is that it's about not being able to access power on your own terms, always through the state. And that's what we see, like post 95, the entire conversation that is labeled as the Panthic conversation is shifted to human rights discourses. And we honor our shaheeds as figures and icons, but of a history, never of a path forward. And in many ways, we censor their legacies as well. We tone down the portrayal of them as Jujarus, and we try to portray them in different ways that are more palatable. Whereas, these individuals, when they were alive, one thing I spent many years, like, many people, like my brothers here and like many people who have watched this podcast, looking at pictures of Jujarus. And I've never really understood them. I'll be like honest, like I've seen so many pictures. Because one is, we don't really have the ability to understand them in that way. And they can only, in my opinion, it can only be taken as face value. Like there's a Singhani has taken a picture of themselves on their wedding day holding Kalashnikovs. What are they communicating to the Panth? What's so complicated to understand? There's countless pictures. You go to like Tribune 1984, countless pictures, I'm like hundreds, if not thousands of pictures of Jujarus standing there holding their shastar. Like they're fighting, a jung on one hand, and they're posing for these pictures. It's not it's not a fashion show, it's not a photo shoot. Like they're leaving a historical record, and what our stance was. So we take these individuals like Bacche, Bibiyan, Singh, Buzurg, that in the harshest environment want to leave a nishani behind. Like tasveer, like Punjab, that mahol us samay da, nishani chadna chaਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ. And we we'll put those pictures out. Some orgs will put those pictures out and edit and take the, shastar away from them. Or try to crop it in a certain way you can't see the shastar, and many will display those images very proudly. And I think that's something that we need to understand, like who these individuals were and what they were fighting for, and the leadership, the agawai that they give us through just existing. And not looking at them as like perfect individuals. Their shahadat makes them perfect, don't get me wrong. Like jado shahidi da jam pi jande a, Guru Sahib kidda samratha, right? Like ona de sare avgun jo vi hege, any incompleteness that a dunyavi person may see is all made complete through, the blessing that they receive of Guru Sahib. And wo kamai karke a, right? Like, if you read our itihas, like ek tak kamai gurbani diya, duja beas jang da, right? Like through surbirta, a gun that Guru Sahib continuously tells us they value, the same as bhakti. Like in some ways I've heard katha where surbirta is valued more than bhakti, because bhakti nu bahut mehnat lag diya, surbirta rahi, through displaying daleri in the battlefield, o parwangi shedi mil jandi hai. So that's like our quote unquote religious aspect in it, that's separated out, but even that religious aspect isn't conveyed in that way. So I think like from 95, when you see that that fierce decimation of the Jujaru leadership, then otte jo reh janda is that vacuum, and we're in that vacuum now. And like if we can't even portray who these individuals were, like look at their level, then what is our level then, innit? Like we got all of the khul, all of the sahulta, and like ਅਸੀਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ, ਫਿਰ like ਸਾਡੀ ਕੀ ਰਹਿ ਜਾਂਦਾ.
And I think in that vacuum, it again signifies the importance of the Sarbat Khalsa, because we would have fallen back into the Akali Dal, right? If we didn't have that agwai, we didn't have that leadership, them making that stance, having that Gurmata, it gives us that it gives that nishana, it gives us that direction. And I think when you talk about
we're forced to make a stand.
Yeah, we have to. Yeah. And I think with the photographs as well, I think they were for the people of the time, that you're under this zulm, we're the ones, we're hearing it. So that's what it was.
But that constant reminder or alignment to what the Siddhantic position is from the Panth, that's so important, because not only is it there in the photos, but like in the Jail Chittiya of Sukha Jinda, for example, Baba Mano Charles letters, even like there's a famous audio we have of
by
Jugraj Singh Diwan, where he says, "Eh koi saadi chalai hoi larai nahi hai, ke ta Guru Nanak Sahib di chalai hoi larai hai, jehdi Guru Sahib ne Babur." So that they're making that link in 1988 back to Babur. So it just shows you how aligned they were with that Sikh consciousness that you mentioned earlier, right? And that for me, like the vacuum thing is one thing, that the being on the ground in Punjab, everything. But if we don't have that same like level of Vishwas or like Dridhata in Guru Sahib and the Guru Panth, then we're really lost. If we can at least maintain that, though I think we're doing the bare minimum is what we need to be doing on that front.
You used the word Jujaru earlier. Jujaru, Akali, same thing, would you say?
Yeah,
It's
pretty
just
much.
It's more different term given to it, basically.
Yeah, Akali Darjaya, like, it's a title, it's a position that's given. Jujaru is a warrior, somebody who's fighting. Akali Jujaru ho sakda. Yeah.
Well, if we're bringing it more to the present day, leadership in terms of in the Panth, I know you've mentioned about a lot of the Jujaru Singhs in that case, a lot of them becoming Shaheed and the movement becoming stagnant in that case. If the Sangat watching it now, what's happening in the present day? And Naveed just given some good points about, the way we should be thinking, and we should be linking it back to that sort. But, is there anything on leadership today?
I think, just to jump in quickly, I think we should be measuring Sikh leadership against that standard that was set. Because if we're all in agreement that in that ideal version of what the Akali is, on a Panthic level, not like in the localized institutional, like Gurdwara level leadership, I think that's maybe creating a difference between that is also important as well.
Yeah.
And also then like with your local Sikh MP, or whoever it might be, somebody in the police or whatever, that isn't, we shouldn't see that as Sikh leadership.
Yeah.
So somebody in a position of prominence or influence or in the public eye is not necessarily a Sikh leader by virtue of them just being in that position.
Yeah.
What makes a Sikh leader is those gun that we spoke about at the very beginning, right? Those who are like Rayatman and Nitnemi Gur Sikhs, have that abhyas, have that, those gun within them. That is what Sikh leadership is. And like, maaf karna, but from my perspective, they're very few and far between who are, who I could pinpoint maybe where they are. And what we're seeing is a lot of these other types of leadership that in this vacuum perhaps are by default being seen as, not even just by like us, but like non-Sikhs, they give them that kind of like, freedom to do all of that. So the question is about how do we measure what a Sikh leader is? And for us, we always have to go back to like our itihas and the standards that are set, in Gurbani on that.
I think as well, like during, these kind of conversations, the questions always asked, what can we do? What should we do? I think we have to be a bit more realistic about like capabilities and the role the diaspora has played, previously in previous Sangarshes, in previous struggles, whether it's the Gadari Babbe led or, it's always been a different response, a different contribution outside of Punjab than it has been on the ground for whatever reason. So I think, when you guys were going through some of the definitions of the people that were allowed to be in part of the meeting, I think even if that was set as a standard for like the Sikhs outside, that how could we become, even capable of being part of the meeting, like bringing up our Jeevan, but also like trying to be more unified in the UK. So listen, like it's a big statement to say that like we should, in terms of fighting the Sangharsh, leading the Sangharsh, or that's a huge task, and I haven't seen evidence of that of a substantial nature outside of Punjab anyway. So instead of giving people unattainable targets, what we should do is that Kalno, the Sangharsh will continue. The Sangharsh is Sadivi will always continue. If it is to pick up in our lifetime, what kind of contribution can we make in the diaspora? So the bare minimums of that would be us as a community in the UK, for example, it should be becoming more like Rayatwan, improving our Jeevan, because obviously there's going to be a Lord, and there will be some blessed souls from the UK who will get to participate more directly. But failing that, at least at the very bare minimum, we can have a unified collective voice, a collective organizing in the UK, because there is going to be all the Lord Penia, like when the Sangharsh is continued, and people look at, and it's the same way we could look at other struggles that are happening. They've got a very very, very solid base outside of where the combat is happening. And those people, those diaspora communities are providing support, logistics, resource, and also speaking on one platform. So if we can even aim towards that over the next few years, it would be a massive step.
Yeah, I mean, like if we look at it in the vein of the Sarbat Khalsa, like 84, 86, like real crisis, difficult period, Khalsa is able to convene, make decisions. 86, 95, they act on those decisions, and they engage in struggle. They try to make that vision a reality. 95 to now, we haven't even been able to meet to discuss it. I mean, I think if you ask, like, General Armsec, they'll say, Panth is doing amazing, right? Like, and, theoretically agree, Panth hamesha charti kala de vich hona chahiye. That's our avastha. But the state of where we are, like politically, our ability to make decisions, our ability to come together, it is steps back from where it was during a much, much more difficult and challenging time period. Like between 95 and now, like, it's been 30 odd years. There should have been like a Sarbat Khalsa, and some people might say like 2015 Sarbat Khalsa. Like I was there in 2015. I mean, I went there for that same reason. Like saw that there was a sadda for a Sarbat Khalsa. I was intrigued. I wanted to go. Wanted to be a part of it. And when you reflect on it, when you think it wasn't in that same vein. I don't think the people that were calling it, or like since from 2015 till like now, with the resolutions they passed, the most powerful thing they did was to appoint Jathar Singh Hawara as the Jathedar of Akal Takat, and there was like a huge outcry of like a jakare from the Sangat. Like it was an amazing moment to feel. They initially began saying that we fully accept the decisions of 86 and we're moving forward, but it wasn't a deliberation in that way. It didn't really function. It was more of a staged, managed event rather than a Sarbat Khalsa, or how it should be. There was not like people turned up, to a space, like an event was announced. It was different.
Sorry to interrupt, but like 50, 100 years time, when we're looking back at Sikh Itihas, if nothing else, the fact that it was a reaffirmation of the 86 Sarbat Khalsa, even in our conditions of like where we are right now, where we were 10 years ago, it still shows you that there is that level of like desire or will within the Sikhs to move towards that, even though it might not have been like in the ideal sense. There was no deliberation or whatever it might have been. It still, for me, shows that it's still part of Sikh consciousness, and we're still having these conversations and trying to move towards that, whatever was decided in 86.
I think it's like it's a underbelly of like Sikh resistance that gives legitimacy, and you see that in like all spaces. Like now, like spaces that are Panthic differently to spaces that were Panthic, when it was a death sentence to be Panthic, right? And now like those terms get thrown and used around, but like the underbelly of Panthic resistance and rebellion is still there. Like what gives Panthic spaces legitimacy is the connection to the Sangharshan. That connection goes back to the 18th century. Without that legitimacy, then it's, I think that's one of the key kind of challenges that you have in the Panthic spaces, is where does legitimacy come from? And everyone claims it from association to the Hathiarband Sangharsh, but they're not able to formulate a politics or a space that moves that Sangharsh forward. They're always like, no matter where they kind of start, ideologically, it always ends up into, this question of where we are right now. It always then ends up back into representation politics. Like whatever route it takes to get there, whether it's like human rights.
I think the other issue as well, which is why we end up in representation politics, is that I think we view things in a different way out here. So we see things as like, I'm involved in some Panthic work. In 10 years or 5 years, I need to see concrete results. I need to see this, whatever. But those Guru Sikhs, they saw it as inni seva pravan karni. Like this is my offering to the Guru, right? This is my offering to the Khalsa. And they had no interest about like, in terms of time scales and like, objectives and that kind of sense. So I think that's what we know. When Garja Singh, Bhutta Singh, like when they did their like, Sangharsh, and they fought, they weren't trying to topple the regime. This was just this is their service, isn't it? So I think we look at things, and maybe it's a Western lens of looking at things, but you see people say, but you see this really, really horrible, thing, what have you guys achieved, or this ever, but it's like, we should, when we look away from that and say, like I see Guru Sahib di khushiyan prapt karniyan, like we want to serve the Guru and put our contribution down, you know, and some people will be on a dasis and some people will be less, but whatever it is, that's what we should look to doing. That or like in 86 or Khalisandi ni rakhi gayi si, and the sings and singing after that, like they've built on that with their sacrifices, and we should continue to just in whichever way we can to build on that.
This is what
Like, you know, sorry, they were saying like the declaration of Khalistan, like some people critique it as well. Like we've not written anything since.
Right.
No, nothing.
Nothing like a manifesto or a declaration, right?
No, nothing of that caliber. And you think
And
it's
still, it's so amazing that like coming out of genocide, coming out of like war, you know, thousands of shaheeds, and they're talking about we won't allow the exploitation of other people. You know, it's still more beautiful than anything that like Indian state has ever like, you know, written about its own. Like, you know, there's some people from, you know, like when I was younger, like, you know, used to watch the cricket and stuff like that. And like nothing makes me feel kind of a sense of kind of pride of like, you know, of anything else other than, you know, the seva that these guys have done, right? The point I'm trying to say is that nothing more since the formation of India has been written as beautiful as, you know, the thoughts that they were kind of sharing in it.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, like that the trap of like falling into this representation politics and the cycle of it, it's like really destructive. It's like really destructive because again, what's been taken from us in this process is the ability to make decisions that benefit the Panth, that are coming from that place of sovereignty, and because right now those that are in the Panthic space, it's not even about like, you know, making a stand, right? Like Bhutta Singh, Karja Singh, they made a stand to declare that Khalsa jiundaya, right? Like the Shahadat bore witness to the fact that of the factor of the Khalsa's defiance, that it can never be crushed. The same thing we see in like Darbar Sahib, you know, the Shote Sahibs are there. It's always about making a stand that our defiance can never be crushed. We're not going to live under the sovereignty of another. We're always going to continue to resist. And now we're like the grammar and the language has changed. And that's been a gradual process, but it has its roots in colonization. And what we saw was in the 80s and 70s, 80s, into the 90s, it was an explosion like of this, you know, the colonial rupture that puts us in a confining position, restricts us, strips our sovereignty away and says you have to exist as this category of individual. You are brown, you are South Asian, you are, you know, a citizen of newly formed India, right? You don't have any right or claim to any other sovereignty. You have to exist in these, you know, constricting conditions. For Kale, it was like literally, it was enslavement. That was the condition of colonialism, that if you wanted to exist in the world, you had to exist as an enslaved, like, you know, virtually non-human. For us, it was, we can serve empire as administrators and as security, and you know, and those are the constrictions. Domesticated citizens. And 86 and 90 represents a rupture, an explosion of those shackles. That's why they call it Galami. And then since then, Holy, this whole process is like rebuilt around us, and our you know, Panthic leadership or institutional leadership. You know, today the SGPC again is like, it's not disbanded, it's not free of Indian government influence. The Akali Dal is moved further from being, you know, where it was set up as a Sikh political party to navigate this new creation, this new system, India, to where it is now. Like, you know, it's not a Sikh political party, it's a political party. It's gone way further, and then like Sikh advocacy has become the language through which we now carve space for the Sangharsh and our existences as Khalsa. And the Akalis and, like, you know, the Jijarupana, it becomes kind of further marginalized. And that's always kind of been like a difficult thing for me to understand, is if we don't maintain space for the Sangharsh, it's already marginalized through the violence. We can't make decisions in any kind of process. So if we don't have the ability to discuss it or to bring it into the center of our conversations, we then commit another layer of violence to a Sangharsh that's already been pushed down and say, look, this isn't a way you can exist in the world. When we look at all of our atiyas, it's like there's a big split, right? Ityas from the 18th century is like Khalsa ne like Teggan de naal raj kar liya, and then when it comes to today, it's like, well, now you got to become part of the system in order to achieve anything. It is a massive disconnect.
We almost kind of go full circle, like back to Santji. Like Santji was essentially talking out, like when they would speak about, you mentioned a few times that when they're like criticizing, not overtly, but kind of implied, or criticizing the Akali Dal, or like that style of like governing or leadership. But they themselves were a Sikh leader. Like so when we talk about this Gun, right? Like it came to mind just now. We have this saying in our like tradition of like puja akal ki parcha shabd dadidar khalsa ka pala sarbatta. Those 4 attributes, Santji embodied all of them. To where they're literally moving the entire Panth forward, right? At one point, and we've kind of now, even after 40 years, we're back in that same milieu of
100%. That's the long-winded point that I was trying to make is essentially that it's like we've gone through this like rupture back into those conditions of confinement where the language of Sikh survival or survivability in this dunya has become the exact type of politics that we fought against, which was the politics of Sant Jarnail Singh, which is we're going to carve space and we're going to exist as like the Shastar Tari Khalsa to now, to now where we are, which is like the model citizen, the model minority, that through appealing and through like functioning in this way, we can achieve like some measure of, that is called success.
Success,
yeah. We can achieve.
It's something that's sought after, something you like work up towards being. It's a career for people, right? It's something you like aspire to be, like an MP or wherever it might be, because that's seen as a pinnacle of like leadership.
And then something, sorry, go on.
I was going to say the point I was trying to get to with the whole leadership stuff for the average Sikh person watching this, when you look 40 years ago and you think about who's the leader, you think of Sant Jarnail Singh Ji, or before maybe Sant Kartar Singh Ji, or whether that was Baba Kali Phula Singh Ji beforehand, years ago Baba Deep Singh Ji. Right now in the current moment in the Sikh Panth, if I'm just saying, we don't have a leader, right? Of course you got Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj. Am I correct in saying that? Are we in a situation right now where it's just, there's a lot of confusion around it? What's the stance right now? Because who do we look towards now, basically, as a Panth?
I think the other thing as well is like back then there wasn't one person.
Yeah.
There's a few people who spearheaded things, but the success of the Sarbat Khalsa in 1986 and the movement that followed was in the absence of Sant Jarnail Singh, which proves that that from the Sangat, those Parabkar Yodhir were like founded and developed in that system.
So it doesn't have to be one person.
No.
And neither does it have to be...
It can't be one person in fact.
Yeah. But does it neither have to be, like right now then, who are those different groups then? It does have to be like either, or is it just coming back to the point of Akali then? Like again, that every Khalsa, every Sikh, one of the biggest things I took away from this podcast is that we just need to all change our mindset and have more of that leadership mindset in our own mind, that we make our own decisions. Let's not rely on somebody else to make decisions for us.
Yeah.
How do we empower ourselves is the question going forward. If right now there's this confusion, we're in the situation right now, how does Sangat watch this podcast and think, okay, how do I empower myself to take steps forward? Or am I just waiting for somebody else to turn up to...
Yeah, I'll let those things answer, but I just want to caveat that with, even the term leadership is quite loaded as well, because I think for some, leadership means like how you're measuring success could be like in the corporate sense.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm now a default Sikh leader because I'm like head of MBNA, whatever that American Express, whatever it might be, right? So for us, that's what I was saying earlier, like how we're determining a successful Sikh leader has to be based on Sikh Siddhant and Gurmata.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of like today, like across the diaspora, even in Punjab, Sikh leadership is a really difficult question to answer, because on the one hand we spoke about how the SGPC, who is supposed to be leading our Gurdwara, was disbanded.
Yeah.
With that, the Akali Dal was given no, any position of like prominence or anything like that. So after the Jujaru Jathabandiyya and Jathedars who were taken out, they were the Sikh leadership essentially in a Panthic sense. Once they've been taken out, we're in this state of we're just kind of going through it, the motions of it. So maybe there isn't an answer. Maybe there doesn't have to be an answer. Like even like in our Ittihas, there was a 60-year period where Guru Sahib is refrained from re-entering Darbar Sahib, right?
Yeah.
So just to draw that parallel, that we're still going through it. Maybe for many of us, we haven't recognized that. And maybe it's because we're in the West, we're so close to institutions like the UN, this discourse of human rights, petitioning and writing to MPs. For us, that is now how we're measuring success. So I don't think it's as black and white as like where is the leader. We're still going through and enduring a struggle. It's a different phase of the struggle.
But I think it's important that during that vacuum, we don't settle and compromise, because that's what happens, isn't it? We can't do this, if you can't do that, then and you always hear the same response, which is that
Right.
they're doing something, but sometimes that's like
sometimes it's good just to stop, pause. Just like this is what the Singhs did in the house. They regrouped, reflected,
consolidate,
and it's not about constantly trying to go forward. It's just about pausing. There's nothing wrong with that.
And there's lots of things, like I was saying, there's a lot of contributions people can make to the Sangharsh in a way that's not like a Panthik Karku Agu, like, some of these people. And at least you're not detracting from their work in it.
Right.
At least we're not like eroding those foundations. If your work is kind of adding to it, then that's what we should be, I think, trying to.
I think, I guess in a more positive way, that what we are seeing a lot more in the diaspora is over the past, I'd say like 10, 15 years, there has been this re-emergence of taking an interest in like our more recent Jathas, but also like on the dharmic side, like I know of so many, you guys will all be familiar with all the good work that's been done in terms of the dharmic prachar and getting, like, for example, like children into basic things like Santya classes, the pronunciation, teaching them out at the house, and also doing so not just like from a perspective of as a history lesson, but showing how like the most recent at the house is linked to their existence today. We had a really good camp in Newcastle a few months ago where kids now are asking these difficult questions. So there is, in this moment where perhaps things have slowed down on this perspective, there's still work to be done, right? There's still a lot of seva to be doing.
Yeah, I think like certain things need to be rebuilt in terms of like the Panth's capacity, and then only then we can see the landscape differently. Right now, everything we're trying to build is within the structures and the ways of thinking and the mode of existing that's keeping us stagnated and stuck in this certain functioning. Like you can live your entire life being a very religious Sikh and have lived a complete life. Whereas in our Ityas, we look at, not the length of the life itself, but the contribution they made to the Panth and the jazba that they declared, right? So I think there's definitely things that need to be rebuilt that take us outside of this like dominant frame. As you're talking like, if you exist in this way, if you build this type of structure, like, I don't know what's popular today, like the think tank or whatever, right? Like, the think tank or like, the charity or like, the institution that operates in a way that we can understand from the Angraj, like a school, in that formal structure. I think there's other methodologies. And like when we talk about the Sarbat Khalsa, that's the Sikh organizing in an indigenous way where their completeness as the Khalsa is accepted. You come into that space as primarily as a Sikh. You come into that space with a connection to the Panth. You come into that space not as somebody who sees the Miri Piri as separate. So I think that kind of mindset needs to come back. And I think a lot of it is tied to this ability to make a decision. So I think that exercise itself is very valuable. Like in that same camp, when we ask kids, like if you had no restrictions, how would you get Khalistan? And all of the methods were the methods of the victim trying to appease the oppressor. They were like, we'll create charity, we'll do this, we'll like, we'll educate people, we'll show them how non-threatening we are. And then therefore, somehow, I don't know how the jump was to Khalistan. It didn't really get there. It was just like, we'll do education, we'll do charity. And it's great, but unless you have a Jajaru element to that, unless you have an Akal Sena or like, a Jathebandi, you can't really pursue those aims and you can't, restructure in that way. So I think there's like Panthic restructuring needed in those terms. But I don't know, I think it's so far outside of like what's permissible to us as a citizen that it doesn't enter into our imagination.
I think one thing that can help with our imagination as well is looking at what's happening today in the world over the last few years, how Qawms are fighting, how they're progressing, if they're progressing, what's working and what's not working, because what we're seeing is that the same methods and the same path, the path will always be the same.
Always work.
ਜਿਹਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਹਥਿਆਰ ਆ, ਜਿਹਦੇ ਕੋਲ ਆਪਣੀ ਹੋਂਦ ਹਸਤੀ ਆ, like not only can they exist in this world, they can protect themselves from somebody trying to do a hamla on them, and they can preserve their bulli, they can preserve their, everything, their culture. They can create their own structures and systems outside of the dominant frame of, the Western powers. Whereas I think Sikhs are more aligned with the Western powers and their ways of doing things and appealing to them. Like, with all of the genocide that was happening in Palestine and all of that violence, out of that, the Sikhs engaged in advocacy work was still talking about international law and the international community. Like, where we're seeing conflicts between two countries and where the Western countries are aligned with nations that indiscriminately target civilians, and the United Nations and all of these kind of institutions is shown as having no power to stop. Even getting a condemnation, like even this country's government, will in this moment, the Keir Starmer has made a lot of statements. I think they're surprised, they're horrified, concerned. Concern is a big one. But they're still, sending drones, they're still providing surveillance, they're still providing armaments, they're still participating in the killing of civilians in order to pressurize a government they disagree with, in order to stabilize their economies, and in order to loosen the grip that's been placed around their necks. And I think Sikhs aren't participants in that in any way, shape or form. I think to ourselves, I think, Sikhs think they're important figures in the world, and they're relevant to world history, but we can't make a decision for ourselves. ਸਾਡੇ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਸਰਕਾਰਾਂ ਕਰ ਰਹੀਆਂ, ਸਾਡੇ ਫੈਸਲੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ SGPC ਤਾਂ ਦਿੱਲੀ ਦਰਬਾਰ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ. Over here, our decisions are being made by institutions and organizations that don't create that space for the sangarsh in that way.
Yeah, that's a really good, important point. And without wishing to generalize, but that importance, or that sense of self-importance that Sikhs have generally, actually is restating how it is the colonizer reshaped the Sikh. So for example, us, going to the UN or wherever it might be, or having this sense of importance, it's because we glorify that we fought for Britain in World War I, World War II, or that we have langar for everyone. Those the things that we're proud of in a really weird way are also the things that are kind of keeping us from the building the capacity to make something for the Panth, because we're so entrenched in pleasing and appeasing, not necessarily moving towards the Panth as a, like I said before, as a sovereign entity to take it forward.
I think one thing needs to be clear, to everyone who's listening, especially to the Najwan, that representation politics and participating in these structures isn't a solution. See, ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ off camera. I've met many Najwan that have shown an interest in entering representation politics, and my advice to them is always the same: be a good MP for your constituents. Don't try to represent Sikhs or the Panth in it. We've got Sikhs in the police force that want to bring Sikhi and Vasakhi into the police spaces, and they want to bring the police into the Gurdwara spaces. It's do your job, man, because our way of sochni is what the Angrez teaches us. It's tusi apna kam karo. Don't come into Sikh spaces and bring that propaganda and prachar. You're in a structure that is institutionally racist, massively misogynistic, and when you face that racism and you don't get that promotion, then you're going to say the police are bad in it. Up until then, it's all good. I think for Najwan to understand that participating in these systems and these structures isn't a solution, is not a way forward, it's not a marker of progress. I think that massively needs to change. And I think in Britain, in particular, it's really perverse. In other mulks, it's less so. But here it's for some reason, because, it's the heart of empire, we've now especially that we've got multiple Sikh MPs that don't demonstrate any Sikh values or any Gurmata-based conduct in these spaces. yet we'll bring them into the Guru's Darbar as examples of Sikh success. I think that differentiation needs to be understood, especially if we're talking in the vein of like the Sarbat Khalsa, 40 years since the Elan of Khalistan. That's pointing us in a different orbit, in a different way. That's pointing us to how we are going to exist in this dunya. And the representation politics, the politics of a deenagi and subedari, which we've got language for and experience of, and atiyas that reminds us that this is how this stuff functions. I think we need to understand it and be a bit more discerning in that, which I think is a skill that Naujawan are going to have to build, because it's something that's going to take them counter to the current. Like, because in Gurdwara, not only the one they function as religious spaces, but they also function as spaces to recruit young Sikhs into this project of being the model minority and being the citizen. The Gurdwara is also, the child will come and learn Santhya, but they'll also come and learn how to be a good citizen and what that means. And that's violence that we're inflicting on our future generation. The same Qaum that says, Ya Baghi Ya Badshah, right? Like the same Qaum that is meant to teach that spirit of rebellion to our bacche, ke tusi Raj Bagh de waris hain. In our spaces, our most intimate spaces, if the police are giving them balloons, yeah, if some like, a clown comes dressed up in a clown outfit with their face painted and says, Tumi mere varga nachar ban, like, would we find that acceptable? We wouldn't. We'll say, like, this is how a Sikh should exist in the world. These are your icons, the Sant Janel Singhs, the Bibi Upakar Kaurs of the generation. These are the figures that we need to aspire to, because they pull us in a completely different direction. And again, it's like our Bol Balle guide us in that way. And I think that's the kind of the space that needs to be carved again. And we see it, don't get me wrong, it's not like, it doesn't exist. It's everywhere. Like, it is like the underbelly, it exists everywhere, in every space, in, videos of Gurdwara in Lebanon, and they got like pictures of like Sant Janel Singh on, and, I went to like the only Gurdwara in like Crete, and like, massive like 8-foot poster of Sant Janel Singh. It's everywhere, right? Like, in Barcelona, like somebody had photocopied a picture of Bayan Singh and stuck it on the notice board, Sialkot, or like some random place, Shillong, like years ago, there was like a flood in Shillong or something, like some remote part of India, and there's the Sikhs were in the Gurdwara, and like a random Gurdwara, really small, and there's a picture of Sant Janel Singh. So it's like, it's everywhere. It just needs to be given more space, and that's the work of the Gurdwara Prabandh, that's the work of the Naujawan Aggu, the Panthik Jathebandi, is how do we create more space for Sikh Sangharsh and resistance and rebellion, and how do we strangle the space that wants us to become Ghulam and sees Gulami as success. Like, they're two opposite sides of the world, and I think that's going to become more and more challenging as the environment that we're living in becomes more and more violent to anybody that doesn't conform, and the standard of living becomes more challenged, survival becomes more challenged, right? Because that's what's at stake here. Is your existence, that unless you conform, you'll be annihilated.
And that Gulami has different manifestations. Right? It's not just the physical slavery, but there's also like economically models of existence that keep us contained. So I think being mindful of that as well, that's a massive lesson that the next generation, even right now, today's 2026 generation, are going to have to, deal with to move forward.
So thank you so much to everybody here today for coming on the podcast and speaking about the Sarbat Khalsa. I think some of the key points was not just the Sarbat Khalsa, like you said, being this event, it's an institution, and also the importance of decision making, which is a big thing that you guys highlighted, and this idea of the mindset of the Khalsa and being empowered, this idea of Badshaahi, whether that's Raj, leadership, going forward, and moving on to the historical part of the Sarbat Khalsa. Examples from Guru Sahib Ji Sama as well, Guru Arjan Dev Ji Maharaj Ji, their Shabad in Gurbani, speaking about Mata. Afterwards, whether that's Guru Gobind Singh Ji Maharaj Ji, the Panth Singhs. So we've got this in the Guru's era as well. And then post 1708, where that's to do with Baba Tara Singh Van, or going forward into history, coming towards 1986, 84, Sant Janel Singh Ji, the Khalsa, the Akalis, the Jujarus, and then talking about 86, how it came together. The previous so-called Sarbat Khalsa that took place, that the government tried to organize, or the Akali Dal in that case, in was 85, I'm guessing, in that period beforehand, and then 86 happening, and then in that was January, 500,000. So, and the pictures look amazing when you see them online, right? And then coming towards April, and the Sangat, not the Sangat, in terms of the declaration of Khalistan, and coming to more towards the present day, and what happened from 86 to 95, and the current situation we're in right now. But definitely there's a lot of things we can take away from the podcast that inspire us, that I've taken away myself as well. Even just those simple things that I've already said a few times, of just decision making and feeling more empowered, and realizing that the structures that we have today in the world, in our guru cards, that we look towards, because that's like our first glance or lens that we see of Sikhi, may not specifically be the actual Sikhi that was around, or is not the actual Sikhi that was around 150 years ago and during the Guru's period, where Miri and Piri came together, and now we've almost split them both up, and you're either one or you're the other, right? You stick to one or the other. So thank you for sharing all of that. Just before we finish off, it'd be nice to just get final thoughts from everybody, just maybe a few lines on a final message that you'd like to leave with the Sangat this year, marking 40 years since Sarbat Khalsa 1986. What would be your final message that you'd like to give to the Sangat to take away from this podcast?
For me, it's like 40 years since the Alan Nama and the Sarbat Khalsa. It should be a massive, massive wake-up call in itself. Like 40 years where we were, the decisions we were making, how we were organizing, in what conditions we were moving in, to where we are now. Largely the 40 years, in Panthic spaces, everyone obviously acknowledges it, celebrates it. You see posts, on social media, etc. But it wasn't like massive programs in every single Gurdwara, even like the Panthic Gurdwara. Like there's, as much as we should honor it, as much notice as we had as a community that this is coming up, is gonna be 40 years. It's not like we haven't even organized a year of smargams around that date. So I think it's a massive wake-up call in that way. Like we have a debt to the Pavitr Khoon and the Qurbaniyan of our fellow Sikh Mai Pai, Buzurg Bacche, Veer Pena, that is, we couldn't pay off for many generations. And clearly, since the 80s to now, like as a generation or two, we haven't been able to pay that karja that's on our heads back. I think we need to honor their sacrifices and their struggle and their politics, and take it way, way more seriously than we do. You can learn more from Sant Janel Singh, who existed 40 years ago, than you can learn from anybody that's around now. I mean, like, isn't that a massive indictment of where we are right now? And, ostensibly, and we've talked about this before as well in different contexts, like on a dunyavi taur, Sant Janel Singh is like unpar. What dunyavi success does Sant Janel Singh have? That clearly shows you that there's more to this game than like some dunyavi equation or puzzle that needs to be solved. And any kanneya, like the akalis, is not like, become renunciates and, turn your back on the dunya. We're all living in the same space. We're all moving in the same space. We've got to preserve and honor and build on the legacy. And that's not any individual organization or Sikh's work. That's our collective Qawmi farj that's been given to us by the Sarbat Khalsa, by the Alan. There's a vision that's been given to us, and we all have to, especially the younger generation that's listening to this, we have to understand what that is, and we have to build on it.
Yeah, for me, I think the biggest kind of takeaway for me that I've taken personally from this conversation, and maybe others will do the same, is we're sitting here 40 years on speaking about the Sarbat Khalsa that happened. And in my mind, I always try and draw parallels like with Dawah Ittihas. And we've spoken a few times about Jatha by Dara Singh Wah. In 1726 and what Nawab Kapoor Singh does, they're not, it would have been about 20 years since the Shaheed Deoband Singh Bahadur, right? But in 1726, 1730s, they're not marking, forget 40 years, they're not even marking 20 years. They're actually rewriting history again. So they're mobilizing. So this point you said earlier about like, aspiring to do more, that will only happen if we recognize that a lot of the questions, the difficult questions that you asked earlier, about leadership and all this and what's happened since 95, a lot of it paradoxically is also due to an absence of sovereignty. So it's almost like a bit of a catch-22, but ultimately we have to still keep moving forward. And like I've said this a few times in camps recently, is that people, like you said, will ask, what do we do? Whatever seva you can do, essentially, if it's for the Panth, and you're doing it, you know, with full like Vishwas and Bharosa in Guru Sahib and having that Shraddha and Pyar, that will hopefully at one point be Parvan as well. But the key thing is to keep moving and recognizing that we all have a role to play. And this one of the things says this same thing, that, you know, us as a global community, you know, recognizing that the fact that we're still facing issues like the whole talk about the transnational repression and, you know, what's happened in recent years, India still knows who the Sikhs are and how to view the Sikhs. Maybe we need to be focusing on, you know, our families, our local communities, our gurukars, to bring that political education back into you know, our psyche and our consciousness.
Theek hai ji, thank you so much, guys, again for your time and sharing, you know, all your knowledge on these topics that we've been covering today. Again, for the Sangat that are watching this, please make sure you check out the previous episodes that we have on this entire series, covering the Jathas going from 1469 all the way up to the present day. And these are just extra, you know, videos that we're making, offshoots on this topic. They're all linked together, and it's quite cool how I'm looking forward to whoever's next, right, that's coming up. So thank you again to the guys. I'm sure I've taken a lot away from this podcast. I'm sure you guys have. Always leave your questions in the comment section. The guys do read it. And again, in the future, maybe we can do a Q&A once we go enough together. Otherwise, we look to answer them in the next podcast. And yeah, we'll see you guys then. Thank you so much, guys. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.